The September morning arrived at Hogwarts with the kind of golden light that made even the oldest stone corridors feel newly enchanted. Mira Whitlock walked toward her first charms lesson with her fingers wrapped tightly around her wand. 9 inches, hawthorn, surprisingly swishy, and her heart performing what felt like its own complicated levitation charm inside her chest. Around her, the castle hummed with its usual morning energy. A suit of armor sneezed as she passed, startling a group of second years. Portraits called out greetings and gossiped to one another across the corridor walls. Somewhere overhead, she could hear the telltale creaking of a staircase deciding to relocate itself, followed by the distant protests of students who'd been planning to use it. The smells of breakfast still lingered, bacon and toast, and something sweet, maybe jam tarts, mixing with the perpetual scent of old parchment and stone that seemed to live in Hogwarts' very bones. Mira had been at the school for 2 weeks now, long enough for the initial wonder to settle into something more complex, long enough to realize that magic, for all its marvels, still required work, still required success, still required proving yourself worthy of the gift. The Charms corridor occupied the 3rd floor's west wing, where the windows overlooked the grounds and the light fell particularly well. As Mira approached the classroom, she could already hear Professor Flitwick's cheerful voice within, greeting early arrivals. She paused at the doorway, adjusting her yellow and black striped tie, still not quite comfortable with how to knot it properly, and took a steadying breath. "You can do this," she told herself. "It's just charms. Just your first practical lesson. Just the class where Clara mastered Wingardium Leviosa on her very first attempt 3 years ago, earning Hufflepuff 20 points and a mention in Professor Flitwick's end-of-year speech. The thought of her older sister did nothing to settle her nerves. Mira stepped inside. The Charms classroom was smaller than she'd expected, but somehow felt more magical for it. Sunlight streamed through tall, narrow windows, illuminating thousands of dust motes that drifted through the air like tiny stars. The desks were arranged in pairs, their surfaces scarred with decades of students' practice, scorch marks from misfired spells, ink stains that had resisted all cleaning charms, and the occasional carved initials. At the front of the room, a blackboard displayed neat, precise handwriting. Today's lesson, the levitation charm, Wingardium Leviosa. Professor Flitwick stood on a stack of books behind his desk, organizing a collection of feathers, some white, some brown, one that appeared to be peacock blue. He was tiny, even elevated as he was, but there was something commanding about him nonetheless. Perhaps it was the way his eyes sparkled with genuine enthusiasm, or the confidence in his movements as he arranged his materials. He'd been a dueling champion once, Mira had heard. It seemed impossible, looking at him now, humming softly to himself as he sorted feathers. But then, that was magic, wasn't it? Never quite what you expected. "Ah, Miss Whitlock." Flitwick noticed her hovering near the door. Come in. Find yourself a good seat. We'll be starting in just a few minutes." Mira managed to smile and moved further into the classroom. Other students were arriving now, a cluster of Ravenclaws discussing something in low, earnest voices. A pair of Gryffindors played dueling with their wands, until Flitwick cleared his throat meaningfully. She spotted a few fellow Hufflepuffs and felt the familiar tug of house loyalty, the desire to sit with her own. But before she could make her way over, a Ravenclaw girl with neat braids and silver-rimmed spectacles caught her eye. "Want to pair up? I'm Astrid Greaves." "Mira Whitlock," she replied, grateful not to have to navigate the social puzzle of choosing a partner. They settled at a desk near the middle of the room, close enough to see, but not so close as to be directly under Professor Flitwick's eye. As the rest of the class filtered in, Mira found herself studying the feather that had appeared on their desk. It was simple, brown, striped with cream, an ordinary thing. She'd seen thousands like it in the owlery, scattered across the floor where the school owls roosted. Yet this one was about to become extraordinary. This one was about to float. If she could make it. "I've been reading ahead," Astrid whispered, leaning closer. "The theory is fascinating. It's not actually about defying gravity. That would require far too much magical energy for a second-year charm. Instead, you're creating a cushion of magical force beneath the object, essentially convincing it that down is now up." "Oh," Mira said, feeling immediately out of her depth. She hadn't read ahead. She'd barely finished reading the assigned first chapter of the Standard Book of Spells, Grade 1. The door closed with a soft click. Professor Flitwick clapped his hands together, the sound surprisingly sharp. "Good morning, everyone." "Good morning. Please, settle down. Settle down. Thank you." He waited for the last whispers to fade. "Today marks an exciting milestone in your magical education. Today, we begin practical spell work." A ripple of anticipation moved through the classroom. Mira's grip on her wand tightened. "The levitation charm," Flitwick continued, his voice carrying despite its high pitch, "is one of the foundational charms you will learn. Simple in theory, yes, but requiring precision, focus, and, most importantly, the correct pronunciation and wand movement. Many of you have likely seen this charm performed. Some of your parents may have demonstrated it, but performing magic yourself is quite different from watching it done." He hopped down from his book stack and approached the blackboard, where he drew a simple diagram with his wand, a curved line, then a sharp downward flick. The wand movement is crucial, a gentle swish. He demonstrated, his wand tracing an elegant arc through the air, followed by a flick. Not a stab, not a prod, but a flick, as if you were brushing a crumb from your sleeve with the tip of your wand. Several students immediately began practicing the movement, wands swishing through empty air. Mira followed suit, trying to replicate the grace of Flitwick's gesture. Her movement felt stiff by comparison. Now, the incantation, Wingardium Leviosa. Flitwick pronounced each syllable clearly, emphasizing the second I in Leviosa. It derives from the Latin leves, meaning light, and, well, we needn't get into a full etymology lesson on your first day. The key is Wingardium Leviosa, not Leviosa, not Leviosa, Leviosa. He made them all repeat it 3 times in unison. Mira's voice joined the chorus, the syllables feeling strange and large in her mouth. Magic words always sounded so certain when other people said them. When she said them, they felt like a question. Excellent. Now, before we begin, let me demonstrate. Flitwick returned to the front of the room and selected one of the feathers from his desk. The peacock one, naturally. He held his wand aloft, and for just a moment, his expression grew serious, focused. Then, with a fluid swish and flick and a clear Wingardium Leviosa, the feather rose. But it didn't just rise, it danced. The feather soared upward, spinning lazily, catching the sunlight so that its blue-green colors shimmered. Flitwick guided it through the air with tiny movements of his wand, making it loop and spiral, dip and climb. He sent it floating over the students' heads. Several ducked instinctively, then laughed, before bringing it gently back to rest on his desk. The class burst into applause. Flitwick gave a small, pleased bow. "Show off," someone muttered good-naturedly, and Flitwick grinned. "Guilty as charged. Now then, your turn. Remember, pronunciation and wand movement. Take your time. Magic rewards patience and precision, not hurried enthusiasm. And do be careful not to poke your partner in the eye with your wand. It happens more often than you'd think, and Madame Pomfrey has strongly requested I prevent such incidents whenever possible." The classroom erupted into activity. The sounds of rustling robes, whispered incantations, and scratching wands filled the air. At the desk beside Mira and Astrid, a Gryffindor boy immediately began swishing his wand with such vigor that his partner had to duck. "Should I go first?" Astrid asked, already positioning her wand. "Sure," Mira said, grateful for the delay. Astrid took a breath, squared her shoulders, and raised her wand over the feather. Wingardium Leviosa. Her pronunciation was perfect, her wand movement textbook precise. The feather trembled. It shifted slightly on the desk, but it didn't rise. Astrid frowned, adjusting her grip. The theory should work. Perhaps I need more conviction in the spell. Intent is important in charm work. She tried again. This time, the feather definitely moved, sliding a few inches across the desk surface. Progress, even if it wasn't flight. Around them, other students were having varying degrees of success. The Gryffindor boy had somehow managed to set his feather on fire, a minor blaze that Flitwick extinguished with a casual wave of his wand and a reminder about proper pronunciation. 2 Ravenclaws in the front row had their feathers hovering, bobbing uncertainly at desk height, like boats on a gentle tide. A Slytherin girl had hers spinning in rapid circles, which didn't seem quite right, but was certainly magical. "Your turn," Astrid said, slightly breathless from her attempts. Mira's stomach clenched. She looked down at her own feather, still resting peacefully on the scarred desk, unaware of the expectation settling onto it. Clara made her feather reach the ceiling. A small, unhelpful voice whispered in Mira's mind. On her first try, Professor Flitwick said it was the finest first attempt he'd seen in 15 years. Mira pushed the thought away and raised her wand. She'd practiced the movement. She knew the words. It was just a matter of putting them together. "Wingardium Leviosa," she said, performing what she hoped was a proper swish and flick. The feather sat motionless, not even a tremble, not even the slight shift that Astrid had achieved. Just perfect, mocking stillness. "Try again," Astrid encouraged. "I think your wand movement was a bit too sharp. Remember, it's a swish, then a flick, flowing, not rigid." Mira nodded and tried to relax her grip. Wingardium Leviosa. Nothing. Around her, the success rate was climbing. The 2 Ravenclaws in the front had their feathers floating near their shoulders now, and they were grinning at each other with satisfaction. A Hufflepuff boy across the room let out a whoop as his feather rose shakily into the air. Even the Gryffindor who'd set his feather on fire had managed to get his replacement hovering at eye level. Wingardium Leviosa. Mira's third attempt came out slightly desperate, her wand movement too forceful. The feather didn't budge. Professor Flitwick appeared beside their desk, hovering, appropriately, into view. "Having some difficulty, Miss Whitlock?" "Aye, Yes, Professor? Show me your wand movement. Mira demonstrated, suddenly hyper-aware of every angle and curve. Ah, I see. You're tensing your wrist right at the flick. Here, watch. He performed the movement in slow motion, his tiny wand tracing the path through the air. The swish carries the magic, and the flick directs it. If you tense up, you're essentially telling the magic to stop before it reaches the object. Try to keep your whole arm relaxed. Imagine you're conducting music, not giving orders. Okay, Mira said, though conducting music felt nearly as impossible as levitating feathers. Flitwick patted her shoulder encouragingly and moved on to help a student, whose feather was attempting to escape through the window. Mira tried again, and again, and again. By the time the lesson ended, Astrid had achieved a proper hover, her feather rising nearly a foot off the desk before she lost concentration and it drifted back down. The Ravenclaws in front had progressed to making their feathers dance in small circles. Even the Gryffindor Firestarter had things under control. Mira's feather had not moved a single centimeter. Don't worry, Astrid said, kindly as they gathered their things. Everyone learns at their own pace. I'm sure that you'll have it by next lesson. Thanks, Mira managed, though the words felt hollow. As she filed out of the classroom with the others, she heard 2 Slytherin students talking behind her. Did you see that Hufflepuff couldn't even make her feather twitch? Isn't her sister Clara Whitlock the one who's brilliant at charms? Makes it worse, doesn't it? Mira walked faster, her face burning. She made it all the way back to the Hufflepuff common room, down the staircases, through the kitchen corridor, past the barrels that required the right rhythm of taps, before the full weight of her failure settled over her shoulders. The common room welcomed her with its usual warmth. The fire crackled merrily in the hearth. The round, honey-colored room smelled of earth and growing things, a reminder of the herbology greenhouses somewhere above. Copper lamps cast a gentle glow over squashy armchairs and thick rugs. It was designed to be comforting, and usually it worked. Today, Mira barely noticed. She sank into a chair near the fire and pulled out her charms textbook, staring at the illustration of the levitation charm without really seeing it. Around her, other Hufflepuffs chatted and worked on essays, their voices a comfortable murmur. Someone was attempting to teach a first-year the Hogwarts school song. Someone else was discussing the upcoming herbology assignment. Normal sounds, normal life. Life that continued whether or not you could levitate a simple feather. Mira stayed there until dinner, reading the same paragraph over and over, trying to understand what she'd done wrong. But the book didn't have answers for why some people could perform magic on their first try, while others, like her, couldn't perform it at all. That night, lying in her 4-poster bed, with the curtains drawn and the distant sounds of the castle settling around her, Mira made herself a promise. She would master this charm. She would make that feather float. However long it took, however many attempts it required, she would succeed. She had to. Because if she couldn't manage something as simple as Wingardium Leviosa, how could she possibly hope to master the rest of magic? How could she possibly live up to being Clara Whitlock's sister? The questions followed her down into uneasy dreams, where feathers multiplied endlessly around her, all of them stubbornly, impossibly still. The week that followed Mira's first charms lesson felt longer than her entire first 2 weeks at Hogwarts combined. Time had a peculiar quality when you were dreading something. It stretched and compressed simultaneously, making the hours between Charms lessons feel both eternal and far too short. Monday's transfiguration class found her attempting to turn a matchstick into a needle. She managed a sort of silver sheen on the wood before the match stubbornly reasserted its matchness. Professor McGonagall's lips had pressed into a thin line, not quite disapproval, but not quite approval either, before she'd moved on to inspect another student's work. Mira had watched as a Ravenclaw girl 2 seats over produced a perfect needle on her 3rd attempt, the transfigured metal glinting triumphantly in the classroom's cool light. Tuesday brought herbology, which was at least more forgiving. Professor Sprout had a way of making every student feel capable, even when their bouncing bulb shoots wilted or their flutterby bush clippings refused to flutter. Mira found some comfort in the greenhouse's warmth, in the smell of dragon dung fertilizer and magical compost, in the simple fact that plants didn't judge you for being slow. "Don't you worry, dear," Professor Sprout had said, noticing Mira's dejected expression when her fanged geranium nipped at her fingers more enthusiastically than anyone else's. "Plants can sense nervousness. You're trying too hard, that's all. Magic responds better to confidence than anxiety." Mira had nodded, though she wasn't sure how to manufacture confidence from nothing. Wednesday arrived too quickly. 2nd Charms lesson. The same golden light filled the corridor as she made her way to Flitwick's classroom. But this time, Mira noticed none of its beauty. Her wand felt heavier in her pocket, as if it too dreaded what was coming. She practiced the wand movement every night before bed. Swish and flick, swish and flick, until her roommates had gently suggested she might want to get some sleep. She'd whispered the incantation under her breath during breakfast, earning odd looks from the older students. She was ready. She had to be ready. The classroom looked exactly as it had before. The same scarred desks, the same afternoon light, the same cheerful Professor Flitwick arranging materials at the front. But this time, instead of feathers, he'd placed small cork pieces on each desk. An escalation in difficulty, Mira realized, with sinking certainty. Heavier objects. Astrid was already seated at their usual desk, her textbook open to the chapter on levitation charms. She looked up as Mira approached and offered an encouraging smile. "Ready to try again?" "As ready as I'll ever be," Mira said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. The class settled. Flitwick began with a brief review of the previous lesson's theory, reminding them about wand movement and pronunciation. Then he demonstrated again, this time with a cork which rose smoothly and hovered at ceiling height before he brought it gently back down. "Corks are slightly more challenging than feathers," he explained, "but well within your capabilities. The same principles apply. Smooth wand movement, clear pronunciation, focused intent. Remember, you're not forcing the object upward. You're inviting it to rise. There's a difference." The room dissolved into practice. Almost immediately, Mira heard the sounds of success around her. A cork bounced upward to the left, wobbling but airborne. Someone squealed with delight as theirs reached shoulder height. Even the Gryffindor boy who'd set his feather aflame last week managed to get his cork hovering, though it spun erratically like a drunk bumblebee. "Wingardium Leviosa," Astrid said beside her, her pronunciation crisp and confident. Her cork rose, not smoothly. It jerked upward in small increments, like climbing invisible stairs, but it definitely rose. It made it perhaps 6 inches off the desk before Astrid's concentration broke and it clattered back down. But still, 6 inches of undeniable levitation. Yes, Astrid grinned. Did you see that? That was brilliant, Mira said, and meant it, even as something tight settled in her chest. Your turn. You've got this. Mira raised her wand. The cork sat on the desk before her, small and brown and impossibly stubborn-looking. She took a breath, trying to remember Professor Sprout's words about confidence, trying to feel certain, capable, magical. Wingardium Leviosa. The cork didn't move. She tried again, focusing on keeping her wrist loose during the flick, on pronouncing each syllable exactly as Flitwick had demonstrated. Wingardium Leviosa. Nothing. Not even a wobble. Around her, the success rate was climbing. The 2 Ravenclaws who'd mastered their feathers last week now had their corks floating in lazy circles above their heads. They were laughing, trying to make the corks chase each other through the air. A Hufflepuff boy, Dennis, something she thought his name was, had his cork hovering steadily at eye level and was attempting to move it horizontally toward his partner's desk. Even some of the students who'd struggled last week were showing improvement. A quiet Slytherin girl who'd barely gotten her feather to tremble was now managing brief bursts of levitation, her cork popping up for a second or two before dropping back down. Mira tried again, and again, and again. By the time Flitwick called for their attention at the lesson's midpoint, her cork had not moved. Not once, not even slightly. Excellent progress, everyone. Flitwick's enthusiasm was genuine, his face glowing with pleasure at his students' achievements. I'm seeing some wonderful wand work. Miss Greaves, Mr. Macmillan, Miss Clearwater. Beautifully done. For those still working on the basics, don't be discouraged. Some of the greatest wizards in history were late bloomers with charm work. The words were meant to be encouraging. Mira knew that. But they landed differently when you were the one still blooming, still waiting to bloom, still feeling more like wilting than anything else. The second half of the lesson continued much like the first. Astrid managed to keep her cork aloft for a full 15 seconds, a personal record that earned her 5 points for Ravenclaw. The cork-chasing Ravenclaws in front had progressed to attempting figure eights. Someone sent their cork so high it bumped against the ceiling, creating a small shower of dust that made Professor Flitwick sneeze. Mira's cork remained resolutely earthbound. She tried adjusting her wand movement, more swish, less flick, then more flick, less swish. She tried saying the incantation louder, then softer. She tried holding her wand differently, standing instead of sitting, closing her eyes to focus better on the magic itself rather than the physical object. Nothing worked. Miss Whitlock. Flitwick appeared beside her desk again, his expression kind but concerned. You're gripping your wand very tightly. Look at your knuckles. Mira looked down. Her fingers were white with pressure, her whole hand rigid around the hawthorn wood. Magic flows through the wand, Flitwick said gently. If you're squeezing it like that, you're essentially damming up the current. Try relaxing your grip. Hold it as you might hold a quill when writing, firmly enough to control it, but loosely enough to allow movement. Mira nodded and tried to relax her hand, but the moment she raised her wand again, the tension returned. It was as if her body didn't trust her not to fail, and so it compensated by trying harder. gripping tighter, forcing rather than allowing. The lesson ended. Students filed out, chattering excitedly about their progress. Mira heard fragments of conversation. "Did you see how high mine went? Professor Flitwick said I had excellent form. Can't wait to show this to my parents over Christmas." She packed her things slowly, hoping to avoid the hallway crowds. Astrid waited for her, which was kind, though Mira almost wished she wouldn't. Walking beside someone who'd succeeded made her own failure feel more pronounced. "It'll come," Astrid said as they exited into the corridor. "Honestly, you're probably just overthinking it. My mum always says the best magic happens when you stop trying to control everything." "Maybe," Mira said, though she didn't believe it. They parted ways at the stairs, Astrid heading up to Ravenclaw Tower, Mira down toward the Hufflepuff common room. The castle was busy with the afternoon transition period, students hurrying between classes, or heading to the library, or simply wandering the corridors because they could, because magic had given them this extraordinary place to explore. Mira walked with her head down, watching her feet carry her over worn stone floors. She passed a group of third years levitating their bags instead of carrying them, showing off, probably, but also just living their magical lives. She passed a portrait of a medieval lady who was having an animated conversation with a wizard in the neighboring frame about the superiority of modern versus historical wand movements. Magic was everywhere, casual and constant and utterly natural, for everyone except her, apparently. The Hufflepuff common room was moderately busy when she arrived. A group of fifth years occupied the large table near the window, their astronomy charts spread across its surface. Some second years were attempting to teach a reluctant toad to hop through a series of small hoops. In the corner, a few first years like herself were working on homework, occasionally consulting one another on answers. Mira settled into her favorite chair by the fire, a high-backed thing upholstered in worn yellow fabric that smelled faintly of cinnamon for reasons no one could explain. She pulled out her charms textbook and turned to the levitation charm chapter, determined to find some explanation for her continued failure. The text was maddeningly unhelpful. It described the wand movement. She knew the wand movement. It explained the pronunciation. She knew the pronunciation. It discussed the magical theory of creating upward force. She understood the theory. But nowhere did it address what to do when you knew everything and could do nothing. "You look like you're trying to hex the book." Mira looked up. Hannah Abbott, a fellow first-year Hufflepuff, stood beside her chair with a concerned expression. Hannah was one of those naturally kind people who seemed to collect friends effortlessly. She had a pink face, blonde pigtails, and a habit of offering encouragement to everyone around her. "Just trying to figure out what I'm doing wrong," Mira said. "With what?" "Wingardium Leviosa, the levitation charm. I can't get it to work at all." "Oh." Hannah's expression shifted from concern to sympathy. She pulled over a cushioned footstool and sat down, her yellow robes pooling around her. "I heard a few people talking about that. Well, not in a mean way," she added quickly. "Just noticing. Are you really having that much trouble? I haven't moved a single object, not even a millimeter, not in either lesson." Hannah was quiet for a moment, considering. "You know Ernest Macmillan, the one who got his cork floating today?" "That's him. Well, Last year he told me his older brother took 3 months to learn the unlocking charm. 3 whole months of Alohomora before he could get a simple door open. And now he's in 4th year and doing brilliantly in charms. Professor Flitwick always uses his cheering charms as an example. The story was meant to be encouraging, Mira knew, but 3 months sounded like an eternity. 3 months of watching everyone else succeed while she failed. 3 months of comparisons to Clara, who'd probably mastered the unlocking charm on her first attempt too. It's only been a week, Hannah continued. That's nothing. Some magic just takes longer to click, doesn't it? Like how some people can't ride a broomstick right away, or some people need extra time to learn their way around the castle. Doesn't mean they're not good wizards, I suppose. Besides, Hannah said, brightening, you were brilliant in herbology yesterday. Professor Sprout was telling Professor Flitwick, I heard them in the corridor, that you have a real gift with plants. Said your touch with the fanged geraniums was the gentlest she'd seen in years. Mira blinked. She said that. I heard it myself. So you're clearly magical, clearly talented, just maybe not at levitating things yet. Everyone has their strengths. It was a comforting thought, even if it didn't entirely erase the sting of failure. Mira managed a small smile. Thanks, Hannah. Any time. That's what housemates are for, isn't it? Hufflepuffs stick together. Hannah stood, adjusting her robes. Are you coming to dinner? Justin's trying to convince everyone we should start a study group for potions. Says if we work together, we might actually understand what Professor Snape is talking about half the time. I'll be there in a bit, Mira said. Just want to read this chapter one more time. Hannah nodded and headed toward the dormitory staircase, probably to fetch whatever she needed before dinner. Around Mira, the common room continued its comfortable rhythm. The toad finally made it through all the hoops, earning scattered applause. Someone's rememberall rolled off a table and under a sofa. A house elf appeared briefly in the doorway, checking the fire and adding a fresh log before disappearing again with a small pop. Mira turned back to her textbook, but she wasn't really reading anymore. Instead, she was thinking about Hannah's story, about Ernest Macmillan's brother and his 3 months of failure before success, about Professor Sprout's compliment, which he hadn't even known existed until now. Maybe it was true that everyone had different magical strengths. Maybe some people were natural transfigurists, while others excelled at charms. Some at potions, while others at herbology. Maybe struggling with one thing didn't mean you'd struggle with everything. But even if that was true, and Mira wanted desperately to believe it was, it didn't change the immediate problem. Tomorrow would bring another day of classes, and Friday would bring another charms lesson. Another opportunity to watch her classmates succeed while her wand produced nothing but stubborn stillness. She stayed in the common room until the fire burned low and the 5th years packed up their astronomy charts. She stayed until her stomach insisted that dinner was no longer optional and her eyes were tired from reading the same paragraphs over and over. She stayed until she'd nearly convinced herself that next time would be different. Nearly, but not quite. That night, after dinner in the Great Hall, where she'd barely tasted her food, after returning to the common room where the study group had indeed formed and was earnestly discussing the properties of moonstone in potion making, After climbing the stairs to her dormitory and changing into her nightclothes, Mira lay in her four-poster bed and stared at the ceiling. Her roommates were already asleep, their breathing creating a gentle rhythm in the darkness. Somewhere in the walls, pipes gurgled softly, the castle's plumbing adjusting for the night. A faint breeze came through the small windows set high in the circular wall, bringing with it the scent of autumn leaves and distant rain. Mira pulled her wand from beneath her pillow, where she'd tucked it. Even in the darkness, she could feel its particular texture, the slight roughness of the hawthorn wood, the way it seemed to warm slightly at her touch. 9 inches, surprisingly swishy. Good for charm work, according to Mr. Ollivander. Good for charm work. Yet somehow, not good enough to levitate a feather. She practiced the wand movement under her blankets, keeping her arm hidden so as not to wake her roommates. Swish and flick, swish and flick. The motion was second nature now, smooth and precise. She could do it in her sleep. So why couldn't she do it when it mattered? Wingardium Leviosa, she whispered into the darkness, barely breathing the words. Nothing answered her except the continued sleeping sounds of her roommates and the distant settling of ancient stone. Mira tucked her wand back under her pillow and pulled her blankets up to her chin. Tomorrow was Thursday. One more day until the next charms lesson. One more day to figure out what she was doing wrong. One more day to somehow become the kind of witch who could make things float. She closed her eyes and tried to sleep, but her mind kept returning to that cork on the desk, stubbornly earthbound despite her best efforts. Kept returning to Astrid's successful levitation, to the Ravenclaw's playful cork chasing, to the easy successes of students who simply could. Sleep came eventually, but it brought dreams of feathers and corks raining down around her, all of them falling, 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 because gravity was real and magic, for her at least, was still just a beautiful idea that refused to become solid enough to hold. Thursday passed in a blur of distraction. Mira's mind was only half present in History of Magic, where Professor Binns droned on about the goblin rebellions in his ghostly monotone. She took notes automatically, her hand moving across parchment, while her thoughts circled endlessly around the same question. What was she missing? In potions, she nearly added porcupine quills to her forgetfulness potion before they'd been properly prepared, a mistake that would have caused the cauldron to melt straight through the dungeon floor, according to Professor Snape's scathing correction. He'd swept past her desk with his robes billowing dramatically, leaving behind a wake of intimidation and the faint smell of old books and bitterness. 5 points from Hufflepuff for dangerous inattention, Miss Whitlock. Perhaps you should focus on the potion before you, rather than whatever is clearly occupying your limited mental resources. The Slytherins had snickered. Mira had felt her face burn hot as she'd carefully removed the unprepared quills from her potion's vicinity and started again. Even Hannah, working at the next cauldron over, had given her a worried look. By the time evening arrived and dinner concluded, Mira felt strung tight as a bowstring. The common room's usual coziness felt suffocating. The cheerful chatter of her housemates, discussing the upcoming Quidditch match, debating the merits of various chocolate frog cards, laughing over a joke someone's older sibling had sent via owl. All of it felt distant, as though she was separated from everyone else by a pane of thick glass. She tried to settle into her homework. She had an essay on the Goblin Wars due for Professor Binns, a star chart to complete for astronomy, and 3 chapters of herbology reading. But the words swam on the page, refusing to arrange themselves into anything meaningful. Around 9 o'clock, when most of the younger students were heading to bed and the common room was thinning out, Mira made a decision. She needed answers, real answers, not just the basic explanations in her textbook. She needed to understand the deeper theory behind the levitation charm, the subtle mechanics that everyone else seemed to grasp instinctively, but that eluded her completely. She needed the library. The thought of venturing through the castle alone at night sent a flutter of nervousness through her stomach, but she pushed it aside. She wasn't breaking any rules, not really. Students were allowed in the corridors until curfew at 10 o'clock, and the library didn't officially close until then either. She'd just be cutting it close on the return journey. Mira gathered her things, wand, a spare bit of parchment, a quill, and headed for the portrait hole. The common room's exit was guarded by a still life of fruit, and you had to tap the pear in just the right way to make it giggle and transform into a door handle. She'd watched older students do it dozens of times, but performing it herself still gave her a little thrill. The corridor beyond was quiet. The kitchen sounds, clanging pots, house elf chatter, the occasional sizzle of something cooking, faded as she moved away from the Hufflepuff area and toward the main part of the castle. The stone floors were cold beneath her feet, despite her sturdy school shoes. Torches burned in their brackets along the walls, casting dancing shadows that made the suits of armor seem almost alive. One of them sneezed as she passed, the same one that always did, apparently suffering from some eternal metallic cold. Mira jumped slightly, then felt foolish for being startled. The portraits were mostly quiet at this hour, their occupants either asleep or visiting friends in other frames throughout the castle. She caught a glimpse of a medieval lady in the middle of stepping from one painting into another, her heavy skirts bunched up in both hands as she navigated the transition. A staircase began to move just as Mira approached it, and she had to wait, slightly anxious, for it to decide on its destination. The castle's staircases had minds of their own. Everyone knew that. But it was still unnerving to stand there while stone and wood groaned and shifted, rearranging themselves into new configurations. Finally, it settled into a position that would take her up rather than down, which was what she needed. The library was on the 3rd floor. She climbed quickly, her footsteps echoing in the empty stairwell. Somewhere in the distance, she could hear Peeves singing something crude and off-key. But thankfully, the poltergeist sounded far enough away that she wouldn't encounter him. Professor McGonagall had made it very clear during the first-year orientation that Peeves was to be avoided whenever possible, and that engaging with him only encouraged worse behavior. The 3rd floor corridor stretched before her, longer and darker than it seemed during the day. The torches here were spaced further apart, creating pools of light separated by stretches of shadow. Mira walked quickly through the darkness and slowly through the light, her wand ready in her pocket, though she wasn't quite sure what she'd do with it if she actually encountered something threatening. But the corridor remained empty except for her and the portraits, one of whom, a stern-looking wizard with a long beard, watched her pass with obvious disapproval. "Bit late for library visits, young lady," he said, his painted voice creaky with age. "Still before curfew, sir," Mira replied, trying to sound more confident than she felt. "Humph. Students today. In my time, we respected proper hours for study." Mira didn't bother pointing out that in his time, whenever that was, they probably didn't have electric torches or indoor plumbing either. She just kept walking until she reached the familiar oak doors of the library. They swung open silently at her touch, revealing the vast, shadowy interior beyond. The Hogwarts library during the day was impressive. Rows upon rows of shelves stretching back into what seemed like infinity. Tables scattered throughout for study, the tall windows letting in natural light that made the dust motes dance. At night, it transformed into something else entirely. Something magical in a different, older way. The torches here burned with a dimmer flame than in the corridors, creating an atmosphere of hushed reverence. The thousands of books seemed to absorb sound, making even Mira's breathing feel loud. Shadows pooled between the shelves, thick and dark and full of secrets. The ceiling disappeared into blackness overhead, either genuinely too high to see or enchanted to appear endless. Madame Pince sat at her desk near the entrance, a pool of lamplight illuminating the ledger she was writing in. She looked up as Mira entered, her sharp eyes taking in every detail with the predatory focus of someone who dedicated their life to protecting books from the indignities of student handling. "Miss Whitlock," she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but somehow perfectly audible in the library's silence. "It's rather late." "I know, Madame Pince. I'm sorry. I just needed to research something for Charms class." The librarian's expression softened slightly, or at least became less actively hostile. "Charms. First year. The levitation charm, I presume?" Mira nodded, surprised that Madame Pince could deduce so specifically. "You're not the first student to seek additional resources for that particular spell." Madame Pince set down her quill with careful precision. "Section 3. Fourth aisle, about halfway back. Look for Practical Charm Theory by Adalbert Waffling, or Quintessence, a quest for more advanced theoretical work. Though I'd recommend starting with Waffling. Waffling is more accessible for beginners." "Thank you," Mira said, genuinely grateful. "And Miss Whitlock?" Madame Pince's voice stopped her as she turned to go. "The library closes at 10. That gives you..." She consulted a small clock on her desk. "Approximately 40 minutes. I will not appreciate having to search the stacks for wayward first years who've lost track of time. Am I understood?" "Yes, Madame Pince. I'll be quick." The librarian nodded and returned to her ledger, dismissing Mira with a gesture. Section 3 was deeper into the library than Mira had ventured before. During the day, she'd mostly stuck to the front areas where the students typically studied. But now, she walked past empty tables and through narrow aisles formed by towering bookshelves, each one crammed with volumes whose spines bore titles in various languages and states of fading. The fourth aisle felt particularly isolated. The torches here were fewer and dimmer, and Mira had to pull her wand out, not to cast a spell, but just to hold for comfort. The books pressed in on either side, thousands of pages containing thousands of years of magical knowledge, and she felt suddenly very small. About halfway back, just as Madame Pince had said, she found the charm section. The books here were organized by topic rather than author, and she had to tilt her head sideways to read the spines, cheering charms through the ages, the dark arts of defensive charm work, memory modifications, a complete guide, banishing and summoning, theory and practice, and there, Practical Charm Theory by Adalbert Waffling. Mira pulled it from the shelf carefully, aware of Madame Pince's likely wrath if she damaged anything. The book was heavy, bound in dark blue leather that had been handled by countless students before her. She could see the wear along its edges, the slight loosening of the binding that spoke of frequent consultation. She carried it to the nearest table, a small, isolated thing tucked between two shelves, and sat down. The chair creaked under her weight, a sound that seemed unreasonably loud in the library's silence. She set the book down, opened it carefully, and began to read. The introduction was dense, full of theoretical language that she had to parse slowly. But as she pushed through it, a picture began to emerge, one that was more nuanced than anything in her textbook. The fundamental misunderstanding regarding levitation charms, Waffling wrote, is the common belief that one must force an object into the air through sheer magical willpower. This approach, while occasionally effective for witches and wizards of exceptional power, is neither efficient nor elegant. True mastery of levitation requires understanding that magic is not about dominance, but about relationship. Relationship. That was an interesting word. Mira read on. When performing Wingardium Leviosa, one must establish a connection between oneself, one's wand, and the object to be levitated. This connection is facilitated by the incantation and wand movement. Yes, but it is powered by something more subtle, intention married to trust. The witch or wizard must intend for the object to rise while simultaneously trusting that it will do so. Doubt creates magical friction, which manifests as resistance within the spell itself. Doubt creates magical friction. Mira sat back, considering that. Was that her problem? Was she doubting so much that the magic itself couldn't flow properly? She thought about every attempt she'd made, the tight grip on her wand, the desperate concentration, the fear of failure shadowing every syllable of the incantation. None of that suggested trust. All of it suggested doubt. She turned the page and found a detailed breakdown of the spell's components. The wing in Wingardium related to the concept of flight, of lightness, of air currents bearing things upward. The Leviosa meant to raise, but with a connotation of gentleness rather than force. Together, the spell essentially meant wings lifted, or let it rise as if on wings. Consider a bird, Waffling wrote. A bird does not force itself into the air through brute effort. Rather, it extends its wings and trusts the air to bear it up. The relationship between bird, wing, and air is one of cooperation. Similarly, the levitation charm requires the caster to create conditions under which the object can rise naturally, or as naturally as magic allows. Mira pulled her wand from her pocket and looked at it. Hawthorn, 9 inches, surprisingly swishy. Mr. Ollivander had said it was suited for charm work, but she'd been treating it like a tool for forcing compliance rather than a means of invitation. She flipped forward, looking for more practical guidance. What she found was a section titled Common Errors in Basic Levitation. Error 1. Excessive force. Students often attempt to push the object into the air through aggressive wand movement and forceful pronunciation. This creates magical turbulence rather than smooth upward motion. Solution. Soften both gesture and voice. Think of coaxing rather than commanding. Error 2. Insufficient commitment. Paradoxically, some students who understand that force is counterproductive then err in the opposite direction, becoming tentative in their spell work. Magic requires confidence, even in gentleness. Solution: be gentle but certain, soft but committed. Error 3. Divided attention. The mind must be focused on the desired outcome without obsessing over the mechanism. Worrying about whether one is doing the spell correctly while doing the spell prevents the spell from working. Solution: practice the components separately until they become instinctive. Then trust them to function while focusing on the intention. Mira felt something click into place as she read. She'd been committing all 3 errors simultaneously, forcing with her wand while doubting in her mind, while worrying about her technique. No wonder nothing had worked. She looked around the library. It was empty except for her and, presumably, Madame Pin still at her desk near the entrance. The aisle was narrow but sufficient, and there, on the table beside her book, a bookmark made of stiff parchment, small, light, perfect for practice. Mira glanced toward where Madame Pin sat, invisible from this deep in the stacks. She probably wouldn't appreciate spell practice in the library, but the opportunity was too perfect to ignore. Mira stood, positioning herself carefully. She laid the bookmark flat on the table. Then she stepped back, raised her wand, and took a breath. Gentle but certain. Coaxing, not commanding. Trust, not force. Wingardium Leviosa, she whispered, barely breathing the words while performing the swish and flick. The bookmark didn't move. But, and this was significant, she'd felt something. Just the faintest tingle in her wand. The barest suggestion of magical energy moving through it. Nothing like enough to actually levitate anything, but present, real. She tried again, focusing on that feeling, trying to amplify it. Wingardium Leviosa. The tingle was stronger this time. The bookmark trembled, or had she imagined it? In the dim light, it was hard to tell. A sound made her freeze. Footsteps, distant but approaching. Madame Pin's, on her rounds. Mira quickly grabbed the bookmark and tucked it into her book, then sat down and tried to look absorbed in reading. Her heart hammered against her ribs as the footsteps grew closer, then paused at the end of the aisle. "Miss Whitlock," Madame Pince's voice cut through the silence. "It's 5 minutes to 10. "Oh," Mira looked up, feigning surprise. "I'm sorry, I lost track of time. I'll go right now." "See that you do. And take that book with you if you'd like. I'll mark it in my ledger. It's due back in 2 weeks." "Thank you, Madame Pince." The librarian nodded curtly and continued her rounds, her footsteps receding into the stacks. Mira gathered her things quickly, tucking the heavy book under her arm. As she hurried toward the exit, she passed rows of silent books, each one holding secrets and solutions to problems she hadn't even encountered yet. The castle was quieter now, the corridors emptier. Somewhere, a clock chimed the hour. 10 long, resonant notes that echoed through the stone halls. Curfew. Technically, she was still within the grace period for getting back to her common room, but she'd need to hurry. She took a different staircase, one that had shifted into a new configuration, and found herself in an unfamiliar corridor. A portrait of a sleeping knight blocked one end, his snores rattling the frame. A suit of armor stood sentinel at the other, its visor down and inscrutable. Mira oriented herself by the windows. She could see the lake glimmering faintly in the moonlight, which meant Hufflepuff territory was that direction. Probably, The castle had a way of rearranging itself just when you thought you'd figured it out. She walked quickly, her borrowed book clutched against her chest. The weight of it was reassuring somehow, as though the knowledge it contained might transfer through physical contact, as though understanding the theory might finally let her access the practice. She was so absorbed in her thoughts that she nearly missed the sound, a faint rattling, like chains dragging across stone. It was coming from somewhere ahead, around the corner where the corridor bent out of sight. Mira froze. Peeves, or something worse. The castle was home to many things that preferred the nighttime hours. Ghosts, poltergeists, the occasional escaped creature from care of magical creatures class, none of which she particularly wanted to encounter alone. The rattling grew louder, accompanied now by a faint moaning sound. Definitely ghostly. Mira pressed herself against the wall, trying to decide whether to proceed or retreat. But the corridor behind her was a dead end. She'd have to go forward eventually. The decision was made for her when a figure rounded the corner. It was nearly headless Nick, Gryffindor's house ghost, his head lolling at an uncomfortable angle on his partially severed neck. He looked melancholy, as he often did, his translucent form glowing faintly in the darkness. "Oh," Mira said with relief. "Good evening, Sir Nicholas." The ghost looked up, startled from whatever thoughts had been occupying him. "Good evening, young lady. Bit late to be wandering, isn't it? I was just at the library. I'm heading back to my common room now." "Ah, yes. Hufflepuff." Nick's expression brightened slightly, or became less gloomy at least. "I do appreciate you lot. Very polite, generally speaking. Not like some houses I could mention." He looked vaguely toward where the Slytherin dungeons lay, his expression souring further. "Are you all right, sir?" Mira asked, noticing his particularly dejected demeanor. "All right, I suppose. As all right as one can be when one has been nearly decapitated and spent the last 500 years unable to join the headless hunt because of a single inadequate inch of remaining sinew." His voice had taken on the whiny quality he adopted whenever discussing his favorite grievance. "That does sound frustrating," Mira said diplomatically. "Frustrating. It's a tragedy." Nick began warming to his theme. "Do you know how close 45 hacks with a dull blade came to complete severing? So very close, but not quite enough. And so I remain in this state of nearly but not quite, forever barred from—" He paused, seeming to notice Mira's glazed expression. "But I'm being a poor conversationalist," he said, making an effort to rally. "You said you were at the library. Studying hard, are you?" "Trying to understand charm theory," Mira admitted. "I'm having trouble with the levitation charm." "Ah." Nick's face, what remained attached to his neck, softened with sympathy. "I remember that spell. Took me quite some time as well, back in my student days. Of course, that was in 1492, so the pronunciation was slightly different. We said Wingardius Leviosa back then. Lost a syllable somewhere over the centuries, I suppose. Language does evolve. Did you figure it out eventually?" "Oh yes. 5th attempt, I believe. Or was it 6th? Memory grows fuzzy after so many years. The trick, as I recall, was not thinking about the spell at all. The moment I stopped worrying about whether I could do it and just did it, it worked. Rather like walking, you know. The moment you think too hard about how walking works, you stumble. It was similar to what Waffling's book had said. Divided attention preventing success. The same concept from two different sources, 500 years apart. Thank you, Sir Nicholas. That's actually quite helpful. Is it? How lovely. I do try to be useful when possible. Makes up somewhat for the unfortunate state of my neck. He brightened considerably. Well, I won't keep you. Curfew has passed, and while I wouldn't report a polite Hufflepuff, some of the other portraits might. Best hurry along. Good night, sir. Good night, miss. Whitlock. Mira Whitlock. Whitlock. Any relation to Clara Whitlock? Lovely girl, always very respectful to the castle's permanent residents. She's my sister. Ah. Well, you give her my regards when next you write home. She once spent an hour listening to the full account of my demise, every hack, every horrible moment, without once looking bored. Rare quality in a young person, that kind of patient attention. Mira promised she would, then hurried on before Nick could launch into the full account of his demise for her benefit as well. She found the way back to the Hufflepuff common room more by instinct than conscious navigation, tapping the pair in the still life with just the right rhythm to trigger the entrance. The common room was nearly empty now, just two sixth years in the corner, playing what looked like wizard's chess with pieces that kept insulting each other. They barely glanced up as Mira crossed to the girls' dormitory staircase. Her room was dark and warm, her roommates all asleep. Mira changed into her nightclothes as quietly as possible, then climbed into bed with Waffling's book. She lit her wand with a soft lumos and continued reading by its light, the covers pulled up to create a tent of concentration. The relationship between witch and spell, she read, is ultimately one of mutual trust. The magic must trust the witch to guide it correctly, and the witch must trust the magic to respond. Without this trust, even perfect technique will fail. Trust. That was what she'd been missing. She'd had doubt, fear, desperation, determination, but not trust. Not the simple confidence that magic would work because it was supposed to work, because that's what magic did. Tomorrow was Friday. Tomorrow was her third charms lesson. Tomorrow she would try again. But this time she would try differently. She would try with trust. Mira extinguished her wand with a whispered, "Knox," set the book carefully on her bedside table, and settled down to sleep. Outside, an owl hooted somewhere in the darkness. The castle's pipes gurgled their usual nighttime song. And somewhere deep in her chest, beneath all the worry and doubt, a small seed of hope had taken root and was quietly beginning to grow. Friday morning arrived with unseasonable rain. Mira woke to the sound of water drumming against the small round windows of the Hufflepuff dormitory, and the grey light filtering through suggested a dreary day ahead. Normally, she loved the rain, the way it made the common room feel even cozier, the smell of wet earth that drifted down from the grounds above. But today, the weather felt ominous, as though the sky itself was reflecting her mood. Her third charms lesson loomed. She dressed slowly, her roommates chattering around her about the weekend ahead, about the Quidditch practice they'd heard was happening despite the rain, about whether the house elves would serve treacle tart at dinner again. Mira contributed the occasional nod or murmur of agreement, but her mind was elsewhere, turning over everything she'd read in Waffling's book the night before. Trust, not force. Invitation, not command. Relationship, not dominance. The concepts made sense intellectually, but translating understanding into action, that was the challenge. It was like being told that riding a broomstick was simply a matter of balance and will. True enough, perhaps, but useless when you were actually wobbling 3 feet off the ground, trying not to fall. Breakfast in the Great Hall was subdued. The enchanted ceiling reflected the weather outside, grey clouds roiling overhead, occasional flashes of distant lightning illuminating the spaces between. The rain sound was muted here. The magic that created the ceiling effect thoughtfully eliminated the actual noise that would make conversation impossible. But you could see the downpour, watch the water that wasn't really there cascade across a sky that wasn't quite real. Mira picked at her porridge, adding honey and cream without really tasting it. Across the table, Hannah was describing an incident from the previous evening where a Ravenclaw's pet, Puffskin, had escaped and rolled through 3 different common rooms before being caught. Justin Finch-Fletchley was debating the merits of various Quidditch teams with Ernie Macmillan, their voices rising with good-natured argument. Normal. Everything was so beautifully, impossibly normal for everyone else. "You're quiet this morning," Hannah observed, looking at Mira with concern. "Everything all right?" "Just thinking about charms," Mira admitted. "Oh." Hannah's expression shifted to understanding. "That's today, isn't it? Your 3rd lesson?" Mira nodded. "Well, 3rd time's the charm, right? That's what my gran always says." Hannah grinned at her own joke. "3rd time's the charm. Get it?" Despite herself, Mira smiled. "I get it. You'll do brilliantly. I'm sure of it." The words were kind, but Mira wasn't sure of anything except her own uncertainty. Still, she appreciated the encouragement. That was Hufflepuff at its best, supporting each other even when success wasn't guaranteed, maybe especially then. The morning's classes crept by with agonizing slowness. Defense Against the Dark Arts featured Professor Quirrell, stuttering his way through a lecture on hinky punks that left most students more confused than educated. Mira took notes automatically, her quill scratching across parchment, while her mind rehearsed wand movements and incantations. Herbology brought some relief. Working with plants always did. Professor Sprout had them repotting bouncing bulbs, which required steady hands and gentle firmness. Too tentative, and the bulbs would bounce right out of your grip. Too forceful, and you'd bruise them. Mira found her rhythm quickly. The familiar feel of soil under her fingernails, and the earthy greenhouse smell, creating a bubble of calm. "Beautiful work, Miss Whitlock," Professor Sprout said, pausing beside her potting station. "You've got the touch for this. Look how settled that bulb is. Barely a bounce out of it. That's the sign of a proper repotting." The compliment warmed Mira more than the greenhouse's humid air. At least she was good at something. At least in one area of magic, she had a natural affinity. But then lunch ended, and the afternoon arrived, and with it the inexorable approach of 2 o'clock. Charms. Mira walked to the 3rd floor classroom with leaden feet. The corridors were busy with students transitioning between lessons, their voices echoing off stone walls. She passed a group of Slytherins who fell silent as she approached, then burst into whispers and giggles once she'd passed. Whether it was about her or something entirely unrelated, she couldn't tell, but paranoia suggested the former. Astrid was waiting outside the classroom, sheltering from the rain that somehow managed to drip through a crack in the ceiling, even this far inside the castle. She waved when she spotted Mira. Ready for round 3? As ready as I'll ever be, Mira said, echoing her words from the previous week. They'd become a kind of ritual, meaningless but comforting in their repetition. I've been practicing all week, Astrid confided as they entered the classroom. Even levitated my hairbrush last night, nearly sent it into my roommate's face, but still, progress. The classroom looked different today. Instead of feathers or corks, each desk held a quill. Actual writing quills, not practice ones. Mira could see the variations in size and color, the way some were pristine while others showed signs of use. These were heavier than feathers, more substantial than corks. Another step up in difficulty. Her stomach sank. Professor Flitwick was already present, arranging materials and humming to himself. A complicated melody that sounded vaguely Celtic. He looked up as students filed in, his expression as cheerful as always. "Ah, wonderful, wonderful. Come in, find your seats. Quickly now, we have much to accomplish today." Mira and Astrid claimed their usual desk. The quill sitting on it was brown and white striped, possibly from a hawk or falcon. It looked even heavier than she'd initially thought. Definitely heavier than anything she'd attempted before. Trust, she reminded herself, not force. Invitation, not command. "Good afternoon, everyone," Flitwick's voice cut through the settling chatter. "Today, we progressed to quills. Some of you mastered corks last week. Excellent work. And so it's time to challenge ourselves further. Quills are slightly heavier and oddly shaped, which makes them more difficult to levitate smoothly. But the principles remain the same. Proper wand movement, clear pronunciation, and focused intention. He demonstrated, as always. His quill rose with elegant grace, spinning slowly in the air before him. Unlike his previous demonstrations, however, he let this one continue for longer, guiding the quill through elaborate aerial patterns, loops and spirals, and figure eights that showed just how much control was possible with practice. "Some of you may find this exercise frustrating," Flitwick continued, bringing the quill to rest on his desk. "Magic is not a race. It's not a competition to see who can master spells the fastest. Each of you will develop your abilities in your own time, at your own pace. What matters is that you keep trying, keep practicing, keep learning." His eyes seemed to linger on Mira for just a moment, and she felt her face heat. Had he noticed her struggles more than she'd realized? Was this speech meant specifically for her? "Now then," Flitwick clapped his hands together. "Begin." The classroom erupted into focused activity. Wands rose, incantations whispered and spoken and occasionally shouted. Almost immediately, successes began to happen. The two Ravenclaws in front had their quills hovering within 30 seconds. A Gryffindor girl, 2 desks over, achieved a wobbly levitation on her second attempt. Astrid concentrated on her quill, her face set with determination. Wingardium Leviosa. Her quill trembled, then lifted, just an inch, then 2. Then suddenly it was floating at eye level, wobbling slightly but definitely airborne. Astrid's face broke into a brilliant grin. "I did it! Mira, I actually did it." "That's brilliant," Mira said, forcing enthusiasm into her voice. And she was happy for Astrid, truly. But the happiness was underlaid with a growing sense of isolation. Everyone else was progressing. Everyone else was succeeding. Everyone else was magical in ways that mattered. Mira turned to her own quill, brown and white striped, mocking her with its stubborn solidity. She raised her wand, remembering everything she'd read. remembering Waffling's words about trust and relationship, remembering Nearly Headless, Nick's advice about not thinking too hard. Wingardium Leviosa, she whispered, gentle but certain, inviting rather than commanding. The quill didn't move. She tried again, focusing on relaxing her grip, on keeping her wrist loose during the flick. Wingardium Leviosa. Nothing. Not even a tremble. Around her, the sounds of success multiplied. Someone squealed with delight. Professor Flitwick called out praise to a student who'd managed to make their quill dance. Even some students who'd struggled with corks were now achieving basic levitation with the heavier quills. Mira tried again, and again, and again. With each attempt, she felt the familiar tightness building in her chest, the frustration, the embarrassment, the creeping certainty that something was fundamentally wrong with her. Maybe she wasn't meant to be magical. Maybe the sorting hat had made a mistake. Maybe her Hogwarts letter had been sent to the wrong person, and somewhere out there, a truly magical Mira Whitlock was living an ordinary muggle life while an ordinary girl struggled to perform the most basic charm. Miss Whitlock. She looked up. Professor Flitwick stood beside her desk, his expression kind but concerned. Too concerned. Pitying, almost. Yes, Professor. I notice you're still having difficulty. Would you show me your technique once more? The request was gentle, but Mira felt every eye in the classroom turned towards her. The whispers stopped. The other students' practice paused as they watched, curious or sympathetic or, worst of all, unsurprised that she was the one struggling. Mira raised her wand, her hand trembling now with more than just magical intent. She performed the swish and flick, trying to make it smooth despite the attention. Wingardium Leviosa, she said, and even to her own ears, her voice sounded defeated. The quill sat motionless, utterly, completely still. For a moment, the classroom was silent. Then someone, a Slytherin boy in the back, snickered. Just a small sound, quickly stifled, but it landed like a physical blow. Professor Flitwick shot a sharp look toward the snickerer, his expression stern. Mr. Nod, if you have so much attention to spare for other students' practice, perhaps you'd like to demonstrate your own levitation for the class. Show us all how effortlessly you've mastered it. The Slytherin boy flushed and immediately returned to his own practice, suddenly finding his quill very difficult to manage. Flitwick turned back to Mira, his voice softer. Miss Whitlock, would you stay for a moment after class? I'd like to speak with you. It wasn't a question. Mira nodded, her throat too tight for words. The rest of the lesson passed in a blur of humiliation. She continued attempting the charm, but her heart wasn't in it anymore. The quill remained earthbound, indifferent to her increasingly desperate whispers of Wingardium Leviosa. Around her, students progressed. Astrid managed to keep her quill aloft for a full minute. The Ravenclaws began attempting to move their quills horizontally as well as vertically. Even previously struggling students achieved at least brief moments of hovering. Only Mira's quill stayed put. When Flitwick finally called time, students began packing their things with a satisfied air of people who'd accomplished something worthwhile. Conversations sparked up, comparing successes, discussing technique, making plans to practice together. Mira sat frozen at her desk, watching Astrid join a group of Ravenclaws heading toward the door. See you at dinner? Astrid called back. Maybe, Mira managed. The classroom emptied. The last students filed out, their voices fading down the corridor. The door closed with a soft click. And then there was just Mira and Professor Flitwick and the terrible weight of impending disappointment. Flitwick pulled over a chair, a regular student-size one, which meant he had to hop up onto it, his feet dangling well above the ground. Somehow, despite his diminutive size, he managed to convey both authority and approachability. "Miss Whitlock," he began, his voice gentle, "I want you to know that I am not disappointed in you." The words were meant to be reassuring, but somehow they made everything worse. If he wasn't disappointed, why did he need to say so? The very statement implied that disappointment would be reasonable, expected even, and only his particular kindness prevented it. "I can't do it," Mira said, the words tumbling out before she could stop them. "I've tried everything. I've practiced the wand movement. I've perfected the pronunciation. I've read theory books from the library. I understand how it's supposed to work. I just can't make it work." "Ah," Flitwick said softly, "and how does that make you feel?" "Like a failure," Mira admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "Like I don't belong here. Like the magic made a mistake choosing me." "The magic doesn't make mistakes, Miss Whitlock." "That's not how magic works." Flitwick paused, considering his words carefully. "Tell me, do you know much about my background?" Mira blinked at the unexpected question. "I know you were a dueling champion, Professor." "Indeed. And do you know how long it took me to achieve that status?" He didn't wait for her to answer. "Years. Many, many years. But that's not the story I want to tell you. I want to tell you about my 3rd year at Hogwarts, when I encountered a spell that absolutely refused to work for me no matter what I did." He settled more comfortably on the chair, his expression growing distant with memory. It was the Patronus charm, far too advanced for a 3rd year. But I was ambitious, and someone had mentioned it in passing, and I became obsessed with learning it. I spent 3 months trying. 3 entire months, Miss Whitlock. I practiced until my wand arm ached. I researched every text I could find. I badgered my professors for advice, and nothing. Not even a wisp of silver smoke. Nothing at all. "What happened?" Mira asked despite herself. "I gave up," Flitwick said simply. "I decided the spell was beyond me, and I turned my attention to other things." "And do you know what occurred 2 years later, when I had long since stopped trying?" Mira shook her head. "I cast it perfectly. First attempt, when it actually mattered. There was a Dementor near Hogsmeade, before they were properly controlled, and I cast the charm instinctively to protect a younger student. A full corporeal Patronus, beautiful and strong, no effort at all." He leaned forward slightly, his eyes bright with emphasis. "The magic was always there, Miss Whitlock. The ability was always present. What was blocking it wasn't lack of skill or talent. It was the weight of my own expectations, the pressure I'd placed on myself, the certainty that I should be able to do it, which paradoxically prevented me from actually doing it. So I should just stop trying." Mira frowned, confused. "No. I'm saying you should stop trying so hard. Stop treating every attempt as a test you might fail. Stop comparing yourself to your classmates or to your sister or to whoever else you've decided is the measuring stick of success." His voice was kind but firm. "The levitation charm is not a judgment of your worth as a witch. It's simply a skill you haven't yet acquired. That's all. Just a skill, nothing more. But everyone else has their own journey. Flitwick interrupted gently. Miss Granger will master this charm quickly and struggle with divination. Mr. Longbottom will find herbology effortless, but battle with potions. You, Miss Whitlock, have a natural affinity for plants that I have heard Professor Sprout praise repeatedly. Each student has strengths and challenges. This, he gestured at the quill still sitting on her desk, happens to be one of your challenges. But it is not insurmountable. It's merely slower for you than for others. Mira felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes and blinked them back fiercely. She would not cry in front of her professor. She wouldn't. I know it's difficult, Flitwick continued, his voice softening even further. Watching others succeed when you're struggling, feeling left behind, wondering if you'll ever catch up. Those are hard feelings, and I don't dismiss them. But I need you to understand something crucial. He hopped down from the chair and approached her desk, having to look up to meet her eyes, even though she was sitting. Magic responds to the heart as much as to the wand, perhaps even more so. Right now, your heart is full of doubt, fear, and frustration. Those emotions create interference, like static on a wireless, disrupting the signal. The magic is trying to flow through you, but it can't get past the noise. How do I stop feeling those things? Mira asked, and hated how helpless her voice sounded. You don't, necessarily. Feelings aren't something you can simply turn off, but you can acknowledge them without letting them control you. You can say, yes, I'm frustrated, and I'm going to try anyway. Yes, I'm scared of failing, and I'm going to cast this spell regardless. The feelings don't have to disappear. They just need to stop being in charge. He paused, then added, may I share one more thing? A technique that helped me years ago when I was stuck on a different spell. Please, Mira said. Stop thinking of the spell as Wingardium Leviosa. Stop thinking about wand movements and pronunciation. Instead, close your eyes and imagine the quill floating. Not as a goal you're trying to reach, but as something that's already happening. See it in your mind, hovering there peacefully, caught on invisible currents of magic. Feel how light it is, how naturally it rests on the air. Make it real in your imagination first, and then cast the spell. And then invite your imagination to become reality. The spell is just the bridge between what you envision and what manifests, but the vision comes first. The wanting, the seeing, the absolute certainty that this is possible, that comes before the wand ever moves. Mira absorbed this, turning the idea over in her mind. It was similar to what Waffling had written, but somehow more concrete, more actionable. Would you like to try now? Flitwick asked. Just once, with no one watching except me. No pressure, no judgment, just an experiment. Mira hesitated, then nodded. She had nothing to lose except pride, and that was already fairly battered. She closed her eyes, as Flitwick had suggested. In the darkness behind her eyelids, she built an image of the quill, brown and white striped, light as air. She imagined it lifting, rising, hovering at eye level. She imagined the gentle spin of it, the way the light might catch on its surface. She felt the rightness of it, the simple truth that feathers and quills were meant to fly, that magic was meant to help them do so. This is possible, she told herself. This is real. She opened her eyes, raised her wand, and let the movement flow naturally, not forced, not overthought, just the swish and flick that her muscle memory knew by heart. Wingardium Leviosa, she whispered. The quill trembled. Actually, genuinely trembled. The tip lifted perhaps a millimeter off the desk before falling back. But it had moved, for the first time in 3 lessons, across dozens of attempts. Something she'd tried to levitate had actually responded. Mira stared at it, hardly daring to believe. "There," Flitwick said, and his voice was warm with satisfaction. "There it is. That's the connection. That's the magic recognizing your intent and beginning to respond. What you just did, that was success, Miss Whitlock. Not complete success, not yet, but real, genuine progress." "But it didn't float," Mira protested. "No, but it moved. And movement is the foundation of levitation. You've just proven that you can do this. Now it's simply a matter of strengthening that connection, building that bridge between imagination and reality until it's solid enough to support sustained levitation." He patted her hand gently, his tiny fingers surprisingly warm. "Practice," he said, "but practice with patience. Practice with kindness toward yourself. And most importantly, practice with the understanding that this spell doesn't define you. You are not your levitation charm, Miss Whitlock. You are a young witch with enormous potential, currently learning one skill among thousands. Remember that." Mira nodded, not trusting her voice. "Now then," Flitwick hopped back toward his desk. "I believe dinner will be served soon, and you shouldn't miss it. Growing witches need proper nourishment, magical and otherwise." "Thank you, Professor," Mira managed. "My door is always open if you need further guidance. And Miss Whitlock, that quill moved. Don't forget that. It moved." Mira gathered her things and left the classroom, stepping out into the 3rd-floor corridor where the rain still drummed against the windows. But somehow, the grey light seemed less oppressive now. The storm outside felt cleansing rather than dreary. Her quill had moved. It was the smallest possible success, a millimeter of motion that no one else would even consider noteworthy. But for Mira, it was everything. It was proof that she wasn't broken, wasn't non-magical, wasn't the mistake she'd feared herself to be. The magic was there. The ability existed. She just needed to learn how to let it out. As she made her way toward the Great Hall, following the familiar path through corridors she was finally beginning to know, Mira felt something shift inside her chest. The tight knot of anxiety that had been her constant companion for days loosened slightly. Not disappearing entirely, she wasn't naive enough to think one small success would fix everything. But it was a beginning, and sometimes she was learning. A beginning was enough. The weekend arrived with a clearing sky and a shift in Mira's perspective. Saturday morning dawned crisp and bright, the kind of autumn day where the air smelled of fallen leaves and approaching winter, where the sunlight slanted through the castle windows at angles that made even the oldest stones look golden and new. Mira woke early before her roommates and lay in her 4-poster bed, listening to the castle's morning sounds. Water rushing through ancient pipes, the distant clanking of the kitchen far below as house elves began preparing breakfast. A portrait somewhere nearby having a conversation with itself, the voice muffled but earnest. For the first time in what felt like weeks, she didn't immediately feel the weight of dread settling over her. Her quill had moved. It was a small thing. Professor Flitwick was right about that. A tiny tremor, a millimeter of displacement. Nothing that would earn house points or impress classmates. But it was real. It was proof. It was a door cracking open where previously there had been only an impenetrable wall. She reached under her pillow and pulled out her wand. Hawthorn, 9 inches, surprisingly swishy. In the early morning light, filtering through the dormitory's round windows, it looked almost warm, the wood grain catching the sun in subtle patterns she'd never noticed before. Good for charm work, Mr. Ollivander had said when he'd handed it to her in his shop all those weeks ago that felt like years. At the time, it had seemed like a promise. Then it had felt like a lie. Now, perhaps, it could become truth. Mira slipped out of bed carefully, not wanting to wake the others. She dressed in her weekend clothes, comfortable robes, her yellow and black scarf, sturdy shoes suitable for wandering. She wasn't sure where she was going yet, but she knew she couldn't stay still. Restlessness hummed under her skin, the good kind, the kind that suggested possibility rather than anxiety. The common room was empty except for a ginger cat curled up in front of the dying embers of last night's fire. It opened one eye as Mira passed, assessed her as non-threatening, and went back to sleep. The portrait hole opened with its usual giggle at her touch, and then she was out in the corridor, free to roam. Hogwarts on a Saturday morning was a different creature than during the week. Without the pressure of classes and schedules, the castle relaxed. Students wandered freely, some heading to the Quidditch pitch, others to the library, still others simply exploring because they could. Portraits chatted more leisurely with passers-by. Even the staircases seemed less inclined to shift unexpectedly, as though they too were enjoying the weekend. Mira found herself walking without destination, just moving through familiar corridors and discovering new ones. She passed the entrance to the library and considered going in. Waffling's book was still in her dormitory, due back soon, but something pulled her elsewhere. She climbed stairs and descended others. She nodded to Sir Cadogan, who was gesturing wildly with his tiny sword at a dragon that wasn't there. She dodged a ghost, the fat friar, looking cheerful as always, and accepted his blessing when he offered it. Eventually, she found herself in a part of the castle she'd only visited once before, the corridor near the kitchen, but past it, where a side passage led to a small enclosed courtyard. It wasn't one of the main courtyards, not grand enough for that. Just a modest square of flagstones surrounded by castle walls, with a few stone benches and an old fountain that no longer worked, but still held rainwater in its basin. The space was empty, private, perfect. Mira sat on one of the benches and pulled out her wand. Then she looked around the courtyard for something to practice on. The fountain was too heavy. The benches were stone and definitely beyond her current ability. But there, caught in a crack between flagstones, a leaf, brown, dried, light as air, even lighter than a feather. She stood and approached it, then used her wand tip to carefully dislodge it from the crack. The leaf fluttered free and lay flat on the flagstone, its edges curled with age. Mira stepped back, creating distance. Then she took a breath and let Professor Flitwick's words flow through her mind. Close your eyes. Imagine it floating, not as a goal, but as something already happening. She closed her eyes. In the darkness, she built the image, the brown leaf, light and fragile, lifting from the ground, caught on a breeze that wasn't quite wind, wasn't quite magic, but something in between. Rising gently, naturally, inevitably. She felt the rightness of it. Leaves were meant to be carried by air, after all. This was just helping that natural inclination along. She opened her eyes, raised her wand, and performed the swish and flick. "Wingardium Leviosa," she whispered. The leaf trembled. It lifted, just barely, just for a second, a centimeter off the ground before settling back. But it had lifted. Definitely, undeniably lifted. Mira's heart leaped. She tried again immediately, not wanting to lose whatever connection she'd just made. Again, the visualization first. The leaf floating, suspended, free. Then the wand movement, smooth and confident. Then the incantation. Wingardium Leviosa. This time, the leaf rose higher, 3 centimeters, maybe 4, and stayed aloft for a full 2 seconds before drifting back down. Progress. Real, measurable progress. Mira practiced for the next hour, standing in that quiet courtyard while the morning sun climbed higher and the castle woke fully around her. She didn't achieve perfect levitation. The leaf never floated higher than a few inches, never stayed up for more than a few seconds. But each attempt felt more natural than the last. Each casting felt less like forcing and more like inviting. By the time her stomach reminded her that breakfast was happening and she should probably attend, she'd managed to keep the leaf hovering for a full 10 seconds. 10 seconds of actual, sustained levitation. It wobbled and dipped, threatened to fall several times, but it stayed up. Magic, real magic, responding to her will. She left the leaf where it was, a small gift to the courtyard, and made her way to the great hall with a lightness in her step that had been absent for days. Breakfast was well underway when she arrived. The 4 house tables were moderately full, students helping themselves to eggs and bacon and toast, pitchers of pumpkin juice and tea and coffee moving between reaching hands. The enchanted ceiling showed the clearing sky, wisps of white cloud against pale blue. Mira slid into a seat beside Hannah, who was discussing something animated with Justin about the proper way to play gobstones. "There you are," Hannah said, momentarily abandoning her argument. "We thought you'd slept through breakfast. That would have been a tragedy. They have those apple pastries you like." "I was practicing," Mira said, reaching for the pastries in question. They were still warm, flaky, perfect. "Practicing what?" "Wingardium Leviosa." Hannah's expression shifted to sympathy. "Oh, how did it?" "I did it," Mira interrupted, unable to keep the smile off her face. "Not perfectly, not like everyone else. But I levitated a leaf for 10 whole seconds. It actually worked." Hannah's face broke into a grin that rivaled the morning sunshine. "Mira, that's brilliant. See, I told you it would happen." "What happened?" Justin leaned across the table, curious. Mira got the levitation charm working. "Finally," Justin said it without malice, just genuine pleasure. "Congratulations. That one's tricky at first, isn't it? I thought I'd never get my feather to budge, and then suddenly it was bouncing off the ceiling." The conversation moved on, someone asking about the Quidditch match scheduled for next month, someone else wondering whether they should start their transfiguration essay now or leave it until Sunday evening. Normal chatter, normal concerns. And Mira found herself participating naturally, not retreating into worried silence the way she had all week. After breakfast, she returned to the courtyard. The leaf was still there, dry and patient. She practiced for another hour, then went to lunch, then returned again. By evening, she could keep the leaf aloft for nearly 30 seconds, guiding it in small circles through the air. It wasn't perfect control, not like Professor Flitwick's elegant demonstrations, but it was her magic, finally responding, finally cooperating, and with each successful attempt, she felt her confidence building. Not the desperate, forced confidence she'd tried to manufacture before, but something quieter and more solid. The confidence that came from actual evidence, from proven ability. Sunday brought similar practice. Mira found herself drawn to the courtyard again, unable to stay away. The leaf had dried even more overnight, had become even lighter, and she found she could lift it higher now, a foot off the ground, sometimes more. She began experimenting with directing it, trying to move it left and right as well as just up and down. There you are. Mira turned, her concentration breaking. The leaf drifted to the ground. Hannah stood in the courtyard entrance, looking pleased with herself. I've been searching everywhere. What are you doing out here? Practicing, Mira said, gesturing at the leaf. Hannah walked over and examined it. Is that what you've been levitating? A leaf? It's lighter than feathers or corks. I needed to start with something easier. Smart. Hannah considered this. Can I watch? Mira hesitated. She'd gotten used to practicing alone, without the pressure of observation. But Hannah's expression was genuinely curious, not judgmental, and eventually she'd have to perform the charm in front of others again. Might as well start getting comfortable with that. All right. She went through her now familiar routine. Visualization first, seeing the leaf float before attempting to make it float. Then the wand movement, the incantation. Wingardium Leviosa. The leaf rose smoothly, more smoothly than it had before. It climbed to chest height and hovered there, spinning slowly in an invisible current. Mira held it for 20 seconds, then 30, then 40, before her concentration wavered and it drifted back down. Mira, that was amazing. Hannah clapped her hands together. You're really doing it. It's just a leaf, Mira said, but she was smiling. It's not just a leaf. It's magic. Your magic. Hannah's enthusiasm was infectious. You've got to show Professor Flitwick. He'll be so pleased. Maybe, Mira said. I want to make sure I can do it consistently first, and with something heavier than a leaf. Well, what's heavier than a leaf, but lighter than a cork? Hannah looked around the courtyard thoughtfully. A feather? Do you have a feather? Mira didn't, but Hannah, ever resourceful, produced one from her bag. From my quill. It came loose this morning. I was going to throw it away, but here, practice with this. The feather was white, probably from a goose or swan, larger than the leaf and definitely heavier, though still relatively light. Mira placed it on the flagstone where the leaf had been and stepped back. The visualization was harder this time. The feather was more substantial, more resistant to her imagination's attempts to make it float. But she focused, building the image carefully. Feather rising, suspended on magic, light as thought. Wingardium Leviosa. The feather trembled but didn't rise. Mira tried again, adjusting her wand movement slightly, putting more conviction into the incantation. Wingardium Leviosa. This time it lifted, just barely, just for a moment, before falling back. You almost had it, Hannah encouraged. Try again. Third attempt. The feather rose several inches and stayed there for 5 seconds before Mira's concentration slipped. Fourth attempt. 10 seconds of hovering, wobbling, but sustained. By the 8th attempt, she managed 20 seconds of relatively stable levitation, the feather floating at eye level while she focused all her attention on maintaining the connection. When it finally fell, Mira realized she was breathing hard, as though she'd been running. Magic, it turned out, was exhausting in its own way. Not physically tiring exactly, but mentally draining. Each casting took focus, will, energy. That was brilliant, Hannah said firmly. Tomorrow in Charms, you're going to do wonderfully. I know it. Mira wanted to believe her. And for the first time, she actually could imagine succeeding. Not perfectly. She was realistic enough to know she wouldn't suddenly be the best in class. But achieving basic levitation with the practice quills Professor Flitwick provided, that seemed possible now. Maybe even probable. They headed inside as the afternoon light began to fade. Dinner was warming and plentiful. Roast chicken, potatoes, vegetables, followed by treacle tart that made Hannah declare the house elves deserved medals. Afterward, in the common room, Mira finally opened her Transfiguration textbook and worked on the essay she'd been neglecting all weekend. But even as she wrote about the theory of cross-species transformation, part of her mind was still in that courtyard, still feeling the weight of the feather responding to her magic, still marveling at the simple fact that after so much struggle, something had finally shifted. That night, as she lay in bed with the curtains drawn and her roommates breathing, creating their familiar rhythm around her, Mira pulled out her wand one more time. She didn't cast anything, didn't want to disturb the others, just held it, felt its particular warmth and weight and texture. "We can do this," she whispered to it, so quietly the words barely disturbed the air. "Together." The wand didn't respond. Wands didn't work that way. But Mira felt better for having said it anyway, as though she'd made a promise, or perhaps remembered one that had been there all along. She tucked the wand back under her pillow and closed her eyes. Tomorrow was Monday. Tomorrow meant classes resuming, routines returning, and, most significantly, the knowledge that Wednesday would bring her fourth charms lesson. But this time, instead of dread, she felt something closer to cautious optimism. She'd proven she could levitate light objects. The magic was there, accessible, responsive. She just needed to strengthen the connection, build the bridge a little sturdier, trust herself a little more. Sleep came easily, and her dreams were peaceful. No falling feathers this time, no mocking quills. Instead, she dreamed of leaves dancing through autumn air, of feathers rising on invisible currents, of magic flowing as naturally as breathing. When she woke Monday morning, the first thought that came to her mind wasn't anxiety about failure. It was curiosity about what she might accomplish next. That alone felt like a kind of magic. The week unfolded with surprising smoothness. Monday's classes passed without incident. Defense against the dark arts remained confusing, but manageable. Herbology continued to be a source of quiet satisfaction. Tuesday brought a successful potions lesson, where she managed to brew a cure for boils without Professor Snape finding anything to criticize, which felt like a minor miracle. And each evening, Mira returned to her courtyard practice spot. She brought different objects, another feather, a small twig, a dried flower she found near the greenhouses. With each item, she repeated the process. Visualization, wand movement, incantation, building muscle memory, strengthening the connection, making the magic more instinctive. By Tuesday evening, she could levitate the feather for a full minute, guiding it in circles and figure eights through the air. It still required intense concentration, still made her head ache slightly afterward, but it worked. consistently, reliably worked. She'd found her rhythm. Not the same rhythm as her classmates. They'd moved on to more complex applications of the charm, while she was still mastering the basics. But that was all right. She was learning that magic wasn't a race. Everyone's path was different. Some people sprinted, others walked carefully. What mattered was moving forward, not how quickly you did it. Tuesday night, Mira made a decision. Tomorrow's charms lesson, her fourth attempt at classroom levitation, would be different. Not because she expected perfection, but because she finally trusted herself enough to try without the weight of desperate expectation crushing her attempts. She would go into that classroom, raise her wand, and invite the magic to flow. If it worked, wonderful. If it didn't, she'd try again. The outcome didn't define her. The trying did. With that thought settled in her mind like a foundation stone, Mira fell asleep Tuesday night, feeling calmer than she had since the school year began. Wednesday morning arrived cool and clear. Mira dressed carefully, ate breakfast without tasting it, attended her morning classes with half her attention elsewhere. And when 2 o'clock finally came, when she walked into Professor Flitwick's classroom and saw the now familiar quills waiting on each desk, she felt something she hadn't felt before entering this room. She felt ready, not perfectly prepared, not guaranteed to succeed, just ready to try, ready to trust, ready to let the magic be what it was, rather than what she desperately needed it to be. She sat beside Astrid, who greeted her with a friendly smile. "Ready for another go?" "Actually," Mira said, and meant it, "I think I am." The lesson began. Professor Flitwick gave his usual encouraging speech. Students raised their wands. The familiar sounds of practice filled the air, incantations whispered and spoken, the occasional squeal of delight or groan of frustration. Mira looked at her quill. Brown and white, striped, solid and real. She closed her eyes briefly, building the image. Quill floating, suspended, free, light as air despite its substance, magic making the impossible natural. She opened her eyes. She raised her wand. She took a breath. And then, finally, she invited the magic to flow. The moment stretched, crystalline and perfect. Mira stood with her wand raised, the classroom sounds fading into a distant hum. There was only her, the quill, and the magic waiting to connect them. She performed the swish and flick, smooth now, natural. The movement as familiar as breathing after days of practice. Her wrist stayed loose, her grip relaxed. The gesture flowed from shoulder to fingertip like water finding its course. "Wingardium Leviosa," she whispered. The incantation emerged soft but certain, each syllable clear. Not commanding, not begging, simply inviting, asking the magic to do what magic did best, make the impossible real. The quill trembled. Mira felt it before she saw it. That distinctive tingle in her wand. The sensation of magical energy flowing through hawthorn wood and into the world. The same feeling she'd experienced in the courtyard with leaves and feathers, but stronger now, more focused. The quill's tip lifted from the desk, then the whole shaft, rising slowly, wobbling slightly, but definitely, undeniably rising. 1 inch, 2 inches, 3. Mira's breath caught, but she didn't let her concentration slip. She held the image in her mind, the quill floating, suspended, held by invisible currents of magic that she was guiding with her will. She felt the connection between them, like a golden thread, delicate but real. 4 inches, 5, 6. The quill reached eye level and hovered there, spinning gently. The The brown and white stripes caught the afternoon light streaming through the windows. For a moment, just a moment, the quill seemed to glow, as though lit from within by the magic itself. "Yes!" Astrid's exclamation broke through Mira's concentration. "Mira, you're doing it." The quill wobbled dangerously. Mira tightened her focus, willing it to stay aloft. The golden thread of connection strengthened. The quill steadied, continuing its gentle rotation at eye level. 10 seconds. 15. 20. Around her, other students were noticing. Practice paused as heads turned. Whispers rippled through the classroom, but Mira barely heard them. All her attention was on the quill, on maintaining that precious connection, on trusting the magic to hold. 30 seconds. 40. "Miss Whitlock," Professor Flitwick's voice, bright with pleasure. "Excellent. Absolutely excellent." The praise sent a warm flush through Mira's chest, but she didn't let it distract her. The quill continued hovering, steady now, as though it had always meant to float and was simply waiting for her to realize it. 50 seconds. A full minute. Her head was beginning to ache with the effort of maintaining such sustained concentration. The golden thread felt strained, stretching thin, but she held on, determined to prove to herself more than anyone that this was real, that she could do this, that the magic worked. 1 minute and 10 seconds. 20. 30. Finally, deliberately, Mira relaxed her will. The golden thread dissolved. The quill drifted downward in a graceful spiral, landing softly on the desk with barely a sound. For a heartbeat, the classroom was silent. Then it erupted. Astrid grabbed her arm, bouncing in her seat with excitement. "That was brilliant. Over a minute and a half. I can barely manage 30 seconds. "Well done, Miss Whitlock," called one of the Ravenclaws from the front. "Finally," someone else said, but kindly, with genuine happiness rather than mockery. Even the Slytherins, who'd snickered at her failures, looked grudgingly impressed. The boy who'd laughed before, Nod, caught her eye and gave a small nod of acknowledgement before returning to his own practice. But the reaction that mattered most came from Professor Flitwick, who had bustled over to her desk with barely contained delight. His face glowed with pride, his eyes sparkling behind his spectacles. "Miss Whitlock, that was outstanding. 1 minute and 37 seconds of sustained levitation on your, fourth lesson? 5th. Extraordinary control, especially for someone who was struggling just days ago." He beamed up at her. "Tell me, what changed?" Mira considered the question carefully. Around her, the class had returned to practice, though she caught several students still glancing her way with curiosity or admiration. "I stopped trying to force it," she said finally. "I stopped treating it like a test I might fail and started treating it like an invitation, like I was asking the quill to float rather than commanding it to." "Ah," Flitwick nodded with satisfaction. "Precisely the insight I was hoping you'd reach. Magic is cooperative, not combative. It responds to partnership, not dominance." He paused, then added, "And you practiced, didn't you? I suspect you've been working on this outside of class." "Yes, Professor. In a courtyard, with leaves and feathers first, then working up to heavier objects." Smart approach. Starting with easier targets to build confidence and skill before attempting the classroom exercises. That shows excellent problem solving, Miss Whitlock. Very Ravenclaw of you. Though I'm quite sure the Sorting Hat knew what it was doing putting you in Hufflepuff. That persistence, that dedication, very much the Hufflepuff way. He awarded Hufflepuff 10 points, which made Mira flush with pride. Then he moved on to help other students, leaving her to process what had just happened. She'd done it. Actually, genuinely done it. The levitation charm performed successfully in front of her entire class. The quill had floated. The magic had worked. She was capable. Try it again, Astrid urged. See if you can do it twice in a row. Mira looked at the quill, still resting peacefully on the desk. The temptation to immediately repeat her success was strong, to prove it wasn't a fluke, to demonstrate consistency. But she was aware of the lingering headache, the mental fatigue from sustained magical effort. Pushing too hard might lead to failure, might undermine the confidence she'd just built. Still, she had to try. She raised her wand again, went through the now familiar process: visualization, movement, incantation. The golden thread of connection formed more easily this time, as though the magic remembered what they'd just accomplished and was eager to do it again. Wingardium Leviosa. The quill rose smoothly, almost eagerly. It climbed to eye level and hovered there with less wobbling than before, the rotation steady and controlled. Mira held it for 30 seconds, not as long as her first attempt, but more than sufficient to prove the point, before gently lowering it back to the desk. Brilliant, Astrid applauded softly. You've got it now. Properly got it. For the remainder of the lesson, Mira practiced variations. She experimented with lifting the quill higher, though anything above head height made the connection feel strained and unstable. She tried moving it horizontally, which was significantly harder than simply levitating. The magic wanted to work vertically, and convincing it to shift direction required careful adjustment of her wand position and mental focus. By the time Professor Flitwick called the lesson to a close, Mira had successfully levitated the quill 7 times, each attempt lasting at least 20 seconds. Not every student could claim that level of success. She wasn't the best in the class. The Ravenclaws in front were performing more complex maneuvers, making their quills dance in elaborate patterns. But she was no longer the worst, no longer the one who couldn't do it at all. She was simply a student learning magic, like everyone else. As the class filed out, several students offered congratulations or encouragement. Hannah, who had charms a different period, was waiting in the corridor and practically tackled Mira with an enthusiastic hug when she heard the news. I knew it. I knew you'd do it. Oh, Mira, I'm so proud of you. It's just the levitation charm, Mira protested, but she was grinning. It's not just anything. It's magic you couldn't do before, and now you can. That's huge. Hannah linked her arm through Mira's as they walked toward the common room. We should celebrate. I've got some chocolate frogs I've been saving. We can share them before dinner. The Hufflepuff common room welcomed them with its usual warmth. The fire crackled merrily, casting dancing shadows across the round walls. The copper lamps glowed softly. Several students were scattered throughout, some doing homework, others playing games, a few just talking and laughing in the comfortable way that Hufflepuffs excelled at. Mira and Hannah claimed a cozy corner near one of the round windows, through which they could see a slice of the grounds. The autumn colors were deepening now, the trees showing more brown than gold as the season progressed. In the distance, tiny figures moved across the Quidditch pitch. The Slytherin team, probably, taking advantage of the decent weather for practice. Hannah produced the promised chocolate frogs, and they traded cards. Mira got Morgana, which she already had, and Hannah pulled Circe, completing a set she'd been working on for weeks. The chocolate was sweet and rich, melting on their tongues while they chatted about the day's classes, about upcoming homework, about nothing in particular and everything at once. Normal conversation, normal friendship, the kind of easy companionship that Mira had been too anxious to fully appreciate before. But now, with the weight of her charms failure finally lifted, she found herself relaxing into it, laughing at Hannah's impression of Professor Quirrell's stutter, debating whether the Weird Sisters were actually good or just popular, planning a trip to Hogsmeade once first years were allowed, even though that was months away, being, for perhaps the first time since arriving at Hogwarts, genuinely content. Dinner that evening tasted better than usual, though the food was the same as always. Roast beef and Yorkshire pudding, followed by apple crumble with custard. Mira ate enthusiastically. Her appetite returned along with her confidence. Around her, the Great Hall buzzed with its typical evening energy. Hundreds of students talking and laughing and living their magical lives. The enchanted ceiling showed a clear twilight sky, the first stars beginning to emerge. Candles floated overhead, their flames steady and warm. At the high table, the professors dined together, their conversation too distant to hear, but their occasional laughter suggesting good humor. Professor Flitwick caught Mira's eye and raised his goblet slightly in salute. She nodded back, smiling. The gesture was small, but it meant everything. Acknowledgement of her success, recognition of her effort, proof that she belonged here as much as anyone. After dinner, Mira returned to her dormitory to collect her things before heading back to the common room for homework. But as she rifled through her trunk looking for her herbology textbook, her fingers brushed against something she'd almost forgotten. The letter from her sister Clara. It had arrived during the first week of term, before charms had become such a source of stress. Mira had read it quickly then, distracted by the overwhelming newness of everything. Now she pulled it out and read it again with fresh eyes. Dear Mira, how's Hogwarts? I miss it terribly. Working at the ministry is fine, but it's not the same as being at school. Make sure you're enjoying every moment. I know I wrote to you before about studying hard and making our family proud, but honestly, forget all that. Just have fun, learn things, make friends. Don't put too much pressure on yourself. I remember my first few weeks being overwhelming. Everything is new, and everyone seems more confident than you feel. But that passes. Soon enough, Hogwarts will feel like home. The magic will feel natural. You'll wonder how you ever found any of it difficult. Give my regards to Professor Flitwick. Tell him his former student says hello, and thank you for everything. He was always one of my favorites. Patient, kind, genuinely cared about his students. If you're struggling with anything, go to him. He'll help. Write soon and tell me everything. I want to hear about your classes, your house, your friends, all of it. Love, Clara Mira. Folded the letter carefully and tucked it back into her trunk. She'd been so focused on living up to Clara's reputation, on matching her sister's supposed perfection, that she'd completely missed what the letter was actually saying. Don't put pressure on yourself. Have fun. Learn. It's okay to struggle. Clara had struggled too. Maybe not with the levitation charm specifically, but with other things. With finding her place, with feeling overwhelmed, with wondering if she belonged. The letter said as much. even if Mira had been too anxious to notice it the first time. Everyone struggled sometimes. Everyone had challenges. The difference was how you responded to them, whether you let them defeat you or use them as opportunities to learn and grow. Mira had chosen growth. Eventually, after some stumbling, but she'd gotten there. She grabbed her herbology textbook and headed back down to the common room, where she found a spot at one of the large tables and spread out her homework. The essay on fanged geraniums wasn't difficult, especially given her natural affinity for plants. The words flowed easily, her quill scratching across parchment in steady lines. Around her, other students worked on their own assignments. Someone was struggling with transfiguration and asking for help. Someone else was practicing wand movements for defense against the dark arts. The quiet sounds of studying created a comfortable background hum. Normal. All of it wonderfully, peacefully normal. By the time curfew approached and students began drifting off to their dormitories, Mira had completed not just her herbology essay, but also the star chart for astronomy, and read ahead in her Charms textbook, productive and satisfying. The work no longer feeling like a burden, but like what it was meant to be: learning, discovery, the gradual accumulation of magical knowledge. She climbed the stairs to her dormitory, feeling pleasantly tired. Her roommates were already preparing for bed, chatting about the day's events. Mira changed into her nightclothes and slipped between the sheets of her four-poster, pulling the curtains partway closed for privacy while still leaving a gap for air circulation. Her wand lay on the bedside table, within easy reach. She picked it up and held it for a moment, remembering the day's success. The feeling of magic flowing through it, the golden thread of connection between her will and the world, the quill rising, hovering, glowing softly in the afternoon light. We did it, she thought, together. She set the wand down and settled into her pillow. Outside the round windows, she could hear the faint hooting of owls returning from their evening hunts. Somewhere in the castle, a portrait was singing, badly but enthusiastically, the usual nighttime sounds of Hogwarts, familiar and comforting. Mira closed her eyes and let herself drift towards sleep. But unlike previous nights, there was no anxiety about tomorrow's classes, no dread about facing another failure, just quiet contentment and the warm knowledge that she'd overcome something difficult. The magic had been there all along. She just needed to learn how to access it, how to trust it, how to trust herself. And now that she knew she was capable, everything felt different. Not easier necessarily. Magic would always require effort, study, practice, but possible, achievable, real. She thought of Friday's Charms lesson, still 2 days away. Wondered what Professor Flitwick would have them practice next. Maybe sustained levitation with heavier objects, maybe directional control, maybe combining levitation with other simple spells. Whatever it was, Mira felt ready for it. Not perfectly prepared, not guaranteed to succeed on the first attempt, but ready to try, to learn, to grow, ready to be a student of magic in all its complexity and challenge and wonder. Sleep came easily, and her dreams were full of floating things, quills and feathers and leaves, all dancing through the air in patterns of light and shadow. And in the dream, Mira stood with her wand raised, conducting the dance, the magic flowing through her like music. When she woke Thursday morning, the first thing she did was smile. A small thing, perhaps, but significant. the smile of someone who'd faced a challenge and emerged victorious. The smile of someone who discovered that struggle didn't mean failure. Sometimes it just meant you were learning something worth knowing. The smile of a witch who could finally, truly make things float. And that, Mira was learning, was a kind of magic all its own. Thursday morning arrived with frost on the windows. Mira woke to find delicate ice crystals etched across the glass in patterns that looked almost deliberate, as though winter itself were practicing artistry. She dressed warmly, extra jumper under her robes, thick socks, her Hufflepuff scarf, and headed down to breakfast with her roommates, their breath misting in the cold corridors. The great hall was especially welcoming in the chill. The enchanted ceiling showed a pale winter sky, and the floating candles seemed to burn brighter than usual, casting pools of warmth throughout the space. Porridge appeared on the tables alongside bacon and eggs, and Mira helped herself to a generous portion, drizzling honey over the oats and letting the sweetness dissolve on her tongue. 5 points to Hufflepuff, Hannah announced, sliding into the seat beside her, for making Professor Sprout laugh in herbology yesterday. She said your observation about venomous, tentacular having similar temperaments to teenage wizards was the most accurate plant comparison she'd heard in years. Mira felt a flush of pleasure. I was just thinking out loud. Well, think out loud more often. We need all the house points we can get if we want to catch up to Ravenclaw. Hannah reached for the toast. Plus, it's nice hearing good things about our house. Feels like Gryffindor and Slytherin get all the attention sometimes. It was true. The rivalry between those two houses dominated most conversations about inter-house competition. Hufflepuff tended to quietly accumulate points through steady work and kindness rather than dramatic gestures, which meant their contributions often went unnoticed. But Mira was learning that quiet didn't mean insignificant. Sometimes the steadiest victories were the most meaningful. The day unfolded with comfortable routine. History of magic remained soporific. Professor Binns droned through another goblin rebellion, while half the class struggled to stay awake. Transfiguration challenged them with matchstick-to-needle transformations, and Mira managed to achieve a proper silver sheen this time, though the point remained stubbornly wooden. Progress, Professor McGonagall had said crisply, which from her was practically effusive praise. But it was the afternoon charms lesson. Friday had come around again with its usual speed, that Mira found herself anticipating most. Not with dread anymore, but with genuine curiosity about what they'd learn next. The classroom was warm when she arrived, the windows slightly fogged from the temperature difference. Professor Flitwick stood at the front arranging materials, and Mira noticed with interest that the desks held multiple objects now. A quill, a small wooden block, and a stone, each progressively heavier than the last. "Ah, Miss Whitlock," Flitwick greeted her with particular warmth. "Looking forward to today's lesson." "Yes, Professor," Mira said, and meant it completely. Astrid was already seated, reviewing her notes from the previous lesson. She looked up and grinned. "Ready to show off your newfound skills?" "Ready to keep learning," Mira corrected, but she was smiling. The class assembled. Professor Flitwick called them to attention with his characteristic enthusiasm, standing on his stack of books so everyone could see him properly. "Today we progress in our study of the levitation charm. Some of you have mastered basic levitation. Excellent work. Now we'll explore variations in weight and material. You'll notice 3 objects on your desk. The quill you know well. The wooden block is approximately 4 times heavier. The stone is heavier still and composed of denser material. Each requires slightly more magical energy and stronger focus to levitate successfully. He demonstrated with his own set of objects, making each one rise in turn. The quill floated easily, as expected. The wooden block rose more slowly but still smoothly, hovering steadily at shoulder height. The stone required visible effort even from him. His wand movement was more pronounced, his incantation slightly louder, but it too lifted, though it climbed only to waist height before he lowered it carefully back down. As you can see, heavier objects require more energy, but the principle remains identical. Visualization, proper technique, and focused intent. Begin with the quill to warm up, then progress to the block and stone as you feel ready. And remember, there's no shame in spending the entire lesson on the quill if that's where you are in your learning. Magic isn't a competition. The room filled with the familiar sounds of practice. Mira started with the quill, wanting to confirm that Wednesday's success hadn't been a fluke. She went through her routine. Visualization first, seeing the quill float before attempting to make it float. Then the wand movement, smooth and confident. Then the incantation. Wingardium Leviosa. The quill rose immediately, almost eagerly, as though it remembered their previous partnership and was happy to resume it. Mira held it at eye level for 30 seconds, guiding it in a small circle before lowering it gently. "Excellent start," Astrid said, already working on her own quill. "Now try the block." Mira examined the wooden block. It was small, maybe 2 inches square, but solid, dense, definitely heavier than any quill. She picked it up experimentally, feeling its weight, trying to understand what she was asking the magic to overcome. She set it down and stepped back, closed her eyes briefly, visualized the block rising, not as easily as the quill, but steadily, inevitably. Wood was from trees, she thought. Trees grew upward, reaching for the sky. In a way, she was just helping the wood remember its natural inclination toward height. The logic was silly, perhaps, but it helped her believe. And belief, she'd learned, was fundamental to magic. Wingardium Leviosa. The block trembled. Mira felt the resistance immediately, like pushing through water rather than air. The magic wanted to work but needed more energy, more focus. She adjusted her mental image, pouring more intention into the visualization. The block rocked slightly, one corner lifting off the desk. "Almost," she murmured, and tried again. This time, the block lifted, just barely, just an inch off the desk. But it was airborne. Mira held it there for 5 seconds before the strain became too much and she had to lower it. Her head throbbed slightly. Heavier objects definitely required more effort. "You did it!" Astrid had paused her own practice to watch. "On your second try." "Barely," Mira said, but she was pleased nonetheless. She attempted the block several more times over the course of the lesson. Her third attempt achieved 2 inches of height. Her fifth attempt, 3 inches and 10 seconds of sustained levitation. By her 7th attempt, she managed to lift it to waist height. Not as high as Professor Flitwick had demonstrated, but respectable for someone who'd only just mastered quills days earlier. The stone, however, remained beyond her. She tried twice, but both attempts resulted in nothing more than a faint tremor. The stone was simply too heavy, too dense, too resistant to her current level of magical strength. "Don't worry about the stone yet," Professor Flitwick said, appearing beside her desk during one of his rounds. "The fact that you've progressed to the wooden block so quickly is excellent. Master that first. Build your magical stamina, and the stone will come in time. Magic is a muscle, Miss Whitlock. The more you exercise it, the stronger it becomes." "Yes, Professor. Thank you." He moved on, and Mira returned to practicing with the block. By the end of the lesson, she could lift it consistently to waist height and hold it there for 20 seconds before fatigue set in. Not perfect, but definite progress. As the class concluded and students began packing their things, Professor Flitwick called for attention once more. "Before you leave, I want to acknowledge something. Every single person in this room has made progress since our first lesson. Some of you are working with advanced applications now. Others are still mastering the basics. But all of you have grown in your abilities, and that's what education is truly about. Growth, not comparison." His eyes swept the room, seeming to linger on Mira for just a moment. 5 points to everyone who successfully levitated something new today, regardless of what that something was. You've all earned it. A pleased murmur ran through the class. Points awarded for effort rather than just excellence. Very Hufflepuff in philosophy, even if Flitwick was head of Ravenclaw. Mira felt a swell of appreciation for the tiny professor who'd been patient with her struggles and generous with his encouragement. Walking back to the common room after class, Mira found herself flanked by Hannah and Justin, who'd been waiting in the corridor. "So," Hannah demanded, "how did it go?" "I levitated a wooden block," Mira reported, "multiple times. Couldn't manage the stone yet, but the block worked." "Brilliant," Justin clapped her on the shoulder. "See, told you it would all work out. Just needed time." "And practice," Mira added. "Lots of practice. That's the Hufflepuff way, isn't it?" Hannah linked her arm through Mira's. "We might not be the flashiest house, but we're persistent. We keep working until we get it right." It was true. Mira had noticed it in her housemates. That particular brand of determination that didn't announce itself loudly, but simply kept showing up, kept trying, kept pushing forward, even when things were difficult. It wasn't the bold courage of Gryffindor, or the ambitious drive of Slytherin, or the intellectual curiosity of Ravenclaw. It was something quieter, but no less powerful. The steady commitment to doing the work, whatever that work might be. She'd found her place in that, found her way of being magical that didn't require immediate brilliance, but rather allowed for gradual growth, for learning through persistence, for success measured in small victories rather than dramatic triumphs. That evening, after dinner, Mira wrote a letter to Clara. She settled into her favorite chair by the common room fire with parchment and quill and let the words flow. "Dear Clara, thank you for your letter. I'm sorry I didn't write back sooner. The first few weeks were more overwhelming than I expected, but things are better now. Much better. I want to tell you about Charms class. I struggled with the levitation charm. Really struggled. For weeks, I couldn't levitate anything while everyone else progressed easily. I felt like I didn't belong here, like I was a mistake, like I could never live up to being your sister. But then I learned something important. Everyone learns differently. Everyone struggles with something. And struggling doesn't mean failing. It just means you're learning something worth knowing. I can levitate things now. Quills easily, wooden blocks with effort. I'm not the best in my class, but I'm not the worst either. I'm just learning, growing, becoming a witch in my own way, at my own pace. Professor Flitwick sends his regards. He's wonderful, patient and kind, and genuinely excited about teaching. You were right to recommend going to him when I was struggling. He helped me understand that magic isn't about force or desperation. It's about partnership, about trust. Hogwarts does feel like home now. The common room is cozy, my housemates are kind, and even the castle's quirks, moving staircases, gossiping portraits, random cold spots, feel familiar rather than strange. I understand what you meant about the magic feeling natural. It's starting to. I hope the ministry is treating you well. Write back when you can and tell me everything. I miss you. Love, Mira. She read it over twice, made a few small corrections, then carefully rolled the parchment and sealed it. Tomorrow, she'd take it to the owlery and send it off. For now, she tucked it into her bag and simply sat, watching the fire dance and feeling the common room's warmth wrap around her like a blanket. Students moved around her in their usual evening patterns, doing homework, playing games, chatting by the fire. Someone was teaching a first year the proper way to clean a cauldron. Someone else was attempting to explain the rules of Quidditch to a Muggle-born who couldn't quite grasp why there needed to be 3 different types of balls. Normal sounds, normal life. The life she'd been too anxious to fully appreciate before, but could now embrace completely. Hannah plopped down in the chair beside her, holding 2 steaming mugs. House elves just brought up hot chocolate. Thought you might want some. Thanks. Mira accepted the mug gratefully, wrapping her cold fingers around its warmth. The chocolate was rich and sweet, with a hint of cinnamon. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire and sipping their drinks. Finally, Hannah spoke. You seem different lately. Happier. I feel different, Mira admitted. Lighter somehow. Like I was carrying something heavy and finally put it down. The weight of expectation. Something like that. The weight of thinking I had to be perfect immediately. That I had to match everyone else's pace, or else I didn't belong. Mira took another sip of chocolate. But I'm learning that belonging isn't about being perfect. It's about showing up and trying and being willing to grow. Very wise for a first year, Hannah teased gently. You sound like a Ravenclaw. Nah, too much effort, Mira grinned. I'm perfectly happy being a Hufflepuff. We might not get the glory, but we get hot chocolate by the fire, and friends who wait in corridors and house elves who genuinely care about our comfort. That seems like a pretty good deal to me. The best deal, Hannah agreed. They finished their chocolate in companionable quiet. Around them, the common room gradually emptied as curfew approached and students drifted off to bed. Eventually, Mira and Hannah headed up to their dormitory, where their roommates were already settling in for the night. Mira changed into her night clothes and climbed into her 4-poster. The bed was warm. House elves had clearly been by with warming pans, and her pillow was perfectly fluffed. Small magics, easily overlooked, but they added up to create an environment of care and comfort. She pulled out her wand one last time, holding it in the dim light filtering through her partially closed curtains. Hawthorn, 9 inches, surprisingly swishy, good for charm work. Mr. Ollivander had been right about that. The wand had been perfect for her all along. She just needed to learn how to use it properly. "Thank you," she whispered to it, though wands didn't work that way. Still, it felt right to acknowledge the partnership they'd developed, the magic they'd created together. She tucked the wand under her pillow, her usual sleeping spot for it, and settled down. Outside, an owl hooted somewhere in the darkness. The castle's pipes sang their nighttime song. Somewhere distant, a portrait was having an argument with itself about whether portraits could actually be considered alive or just magically animated representations of formerly living people. Normal Hogwarts sounds, home sounds. Mira closed her eyes and let sleep come naturally. Her last conscious thought was about Monday's classes, about continuing to practice the levitation charm, about eventually mastering that stone and moving on to whatever came next in the curriculum. There would be other challenges, she knew, other spells that would prove difficult, other areas of magic that would require the same patience and persistence that the levitation charm had demanded. That was the nature of learning. There was always something new to struggle with, always another mountain to climb. But she'd proven to herself that she could climb them. Maybe not quickly, maybe not with the ease that others displayed, but steadily, persistently, with a particular Hufflepuff determination that valued effort as much as outcome. The real magic she was learning wasn't in the spells themselves, though those were wonderful. The real magic was in the journey, in the struggle and the growth, in discovering that you were capable of more than you believed, in learning that failure wasn't the opposite of success, but rather a necessary step towards it. That was the lesson the levitation charm had truly taught her. Not how to make things float, though she'd learned that too, but how to trust herself, how to be patient with her own learning, how to measure success not by comparison to others, but by her own progress, her own growth, her own gradually expanding abilities. She'd made a quill hover and glow softly in afternoon light. Such a small thing, really. A basic first-year charm that thousands of students learned every year at Hogwarts. Nothing special or unique about it, except it was special, because it was hers, because she'd struggled for it, worked for it, earned it through persistence and practice, and refusing to give up even when giving up seemed like the easier option. That made it magical in a way that went beyond the technical definition, made it a victory worth celebrating not because of what it was, but because of what it represented. Proof that she belonged here, proof that she was capable, proof that patience and persistence could overcome even the most stubborn obstacles. Small victories, perhaps, but the lasting kind, the kind that built foundations for everything that came after, the kind that changed not just what you could do, but who you knew yourself to be. In her dreams that night, Mira stood in a classroom filled with sunlight. Around her, objects floated peacefully, quills and blocks and stones and feathers and leaves, all suspended on invisible currents of magic. And she conducted them with her wand like a symphony, each item responding to her intent, the magic flowing through her as naturally as breathing. When she woke Saturday morning to frost on the windows and sunlight streaming through the gaps in her curtains, she woke smiling, ready for whatever came next, ready to keep learning, keep growing, keep discovering new magics both large and small, ready to be exactly who she was. Mira Whitlock, first-year Hufflepuff, student of magic, capable witch, who'd learned that the most important spell wasn't written in any textbook. It was simply this: believing in yourself, even when, especially when, that belief required courage. That was the real magic, and it would last far longer than any levitation charm. The fire in the Hufflepuff common room had burned down to glowing embers, casting a soft amber light across the round walls. Outside the windows, snow had begun to fall. The first real snow of the season, dusting the grounds in white and transforming Hogwarts into something even more magical than usual. Mira sat curled in her favorite chair, a blanket draped over her shoulders and a mug of warm butterbeer cradled in her hands. Around her, the common room hummed with its usual Saturday evening contentment. A few students played Exploding Snap near the fireplace, their laughter punctuating the quiet. Others worked on essays or read by lamplight. Hannah was attempting to teach a second year the proper technique for shuffling chocolate frog cards without bending them. It had been 2 months since that first charms lesson. 2 months since she'd stared at a feather and felt the crushing weight of failure. 2 months of struggle and practiced and gradual, hard-won progress. Now, the levitation charm was second nature. She could float quills without thinking, could levitate wooden blocks with barely any effort, and had recently managed to lift the stone. Not gracefully, not for long, but successfully nonetheless. Professor Flitwick had awarded her 10 points for Hufflepuff and suggested she might have a real talent for charm work after all. Just needed the right approach, he'd said with a knowing twinkle in his eye. The right approach, that had made all the difference. Not force, but invitation. Not desperation, but trust. Not comparison, but personal growth measured against her own progress rather than others' achievements. She'd learned other charms since then. The unlocking charm, which had come surprisingly easily. The knockback jinx, still working on that one. And just yesterday, the fire-making spell, which she'd managed on her 3rd attempt, much to her delight. Each new spell brought its own challenges, its own learning curve. But none of them carried the same weight as that first one had. None of them felt like tests of her worthiness to be magical, because she knew now, deep in her bones where it mattered most, that she belonged here, that she was magical, that struggling with a spell didn't mean she was broken. It just meant she was learning something worth knowing. The portrait hole opened, letting in a gust of cold air, along with a group of older students returning from somewhere, their robes dusted with snow and their faces flushed with cold and laughter. They called out greetings as they passed through, heading toward the dormitories to warm up. Mira watched them go, then turned her attention back to the mug in her hands. The butterbeer had cooled slightly, but it was still sweet and comforting, warming her from the inside out. A letter had arrived from Clara that morning, full of stories about ministry life and questions about Mira's classes. But the part that had struck Mira most was near the end. "I'm so proud of you, Mira. Not because you learned the levitation charm, though that's wonderful, but because you didn't give up when it was hard. That's the real magic, you know. Not the spells themselves, but the determination to keep trying even when success seems impossible. That's what makes a good witch. That's what makes a good person. I never told you this, but I struggled too. With potions, mostly. Spent half my second year convinced I'd never brew anything correctly. Professor Snape terrified me. and I was certain he thought I was hopeless. But I kept showing up, kept practicing, kept learning. Eventually, it got easier. Not perfect, never perfect, but manageable. Everyone has their challenges, Mira. The difference is in how we face them. Mira had read those words multiple times, feeling something settle in her chest with each reading. Clara, brilliant, accomplished, seemingly perfect Clara, had struggled too, had doubted herself too, had felt inadequate and overwhelmed and uncertain about her place in the magical world. It didn't make Mira's own struggles less real, but it made them feel less isolating, made them feel like part of the shared experience of learning magic rather than evidence of personal failure. She finished her butterbeer and set the empty mug aside. The common room was thinning out now as students headed to bed. Hannah had given up on teaching card shuffling and was heading upstairs, calling a good night over her shoulder. The exploding snap game had concluded with someone's eyebrows slightly singed, but spirits high. Soon, Mira would head up too, would climb into her warm bed and fall asleep to the sound of snow tapping against windows and the castle settling around her like a contented cat, would dream of floating things and glowing quills and the golden threads of magic that connected intention to reality. But for now, she sat in the firelight and let herself feel the full weight of what she'd accomplished. Not just the levitation charm, though that remained significant, but the larger victory of learning to trust herself, of discovering that persistence mattered more than immediate perfection, of understanding that her worth as a witch wasn't measured by how quickly she mastered spells, but by her willingness to keep trying, even when trying was hard. Outside, the snow continued to fall. Inside, the fire crackled softly, and in the space between winter and warmth, between struggle and success, between who she'd been and who she was becoming, Mira Whitlock sat wrapped in a blanket and felt completely, peacefully at home. Magic, she'd learned, wasn't just about waving wands and speaking incantations. It was about transformation, both of the world around you and of yourself. It was about discovering capabilities you didn't know you possessed. It was about becoming someone who believed in their own potential, even when that belief required courage. She'd made a quill float. Such a small thing, really, in the vast scope of magical education that stretched before her. Years of classes and spells, and increasingly complex magic still waited. Challenges she couldn't yet imagine. Struggles that would require the same patience and persistence that the levitation charm had demanded. But she'd proven to herself that she could meet those challenges. Maybe not gracefully, maybe not quickly, but successfully, eventually, with enough practice and enough trust and enough willingness to keep trying even when the trying was difficult. That knowledge, that bone-deep certainty of her own capability was worth more than any number of perfectly executed spells. The fire flickered, casting dancing shadows across the copper lamps and yellow walls. Somewhere in the castle, a clock chimed 10. Time for bed, for sleep, for dreams of tomorrow's possibilities. Mira stood, folded her blanket neatly, and headed toward the girls' dormitory staircase. As she climbed, her hand brushed against her wand in her pocket. Hawthorn, 9 inches, surprisingly swishy. Her partner in magic, her tool for transformation, her bridge between imagination and reality. "Thank you," she whispered to it again, even though wands didn't work that way. Even though gratitude didn't strengthen spells or improve technique. but it felt right nonetheless. Felt important to acknowledge what they'd accomplished together. The small victories that had added up to something significant. The magic that had emerged not from perfection, but from persistence. She climbed into bed and pulled the curtains closed, cocooning herself in warmth and darkness. Tomorrow would bring new lessons, new challenges, new opportunities to grow. But tonight, she could rest in the satisfaction of how far she'd already come. Outside, snow transformed Hogwarts into a winter wonderland. Inside, a young witch drifted toward sleep with a smile on her face and magic humming gently through her veins. She'd learned to make things float. But more importantly, she'd learned that she could learn. That struggle didn't equal failure. That patience and persistence could overcome almost any obstacle. And that lesson, that fundamental understanding of her own capability, would carry her through whatever came next. Small victories perhaps, but the lasting kind, the magical kind, the kind that mattered most.